see what you're saying. Because what I did was I was looking at this show.
For your PowerPoint, you may want to grab that. He's going to talk about the first 5 slides first and just kind of give us a set for the day. And then Carrie's going to tell you a little bit more about today's meet.
Yes. So you can see our technology today. We are as technologically advanced as we can be at this moment in time. We have 3 different screens going on. Over here you'll see you have your PowerPoint, and I actually sent you in an email the PowerPoint, so you'll have it on your own computer to look at, take notes on, whatever you need. The second screen, of course, up here in the front is going to be David, so when he's Skyping, he'll be able to hear everything we're saying. If you're in the back of the room, you're probably going to have to speak pretty loudly because he's picking it up on the microphone that's connected to this computer. But he's coming in over the speakers in the room, so everybody should be able to hear him. Okay? And then finally, our third screen is the Today's Meet website, and I also sent you that link in the same email where your PowerPoint is. And that Today's Meet, I don't know if you're familiar with it, but all it is it's a place, it's kind of just like an online thread feed of information. So you'll go in there, you'll be able to type your name, and then just go ahead and put messages in. So throughout the day, we're going to be asking you to post different questions or different comments. And this is a way for us to be able to track our thinking as
Y'all are
others.
stretching us today, aren't you?
I know.
Yes.
But also to have David get a chance to read through this as well, so he can kind of get an idea of our processing through this, since he's not here physically.
And any questions that you have during the day, you might want to just say, you know, David, and then a question that you want him to answer, because he's going to come back with us from 2:15 to 3, have another Skype session and talk to us about the day and talk to us about the questions and the comments that you've had. So that's kind of our link to him today.
Okay. Are there any questions? Okay. Then we're going to go ahead and give him a call, and hopefully everything will work out.
Yeah. If you don't have a computer, and you probably want one today, there are laptops in that other room in the cart. So go grab one and then.
Yeah, and if you're going to get one, go ahead and get one real quick because they're getting ready to start another meeting.
Yeah.
Maybe he stepped away from his computer.
David, we did talk to him a second ago. His wife, you know, I think he told you, is at a very high-risk pregnancy. She's at week 29, and he said they had a rough last night, and he's expecting a baby possibly to be born before Halloween. So we probably have to keep them in our prayers. But it's a girl, he said.
Hey, David.
Hi there.
Can you hear me okay?
I can.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yes, definitely. We can hear you over all the speakers in the room, so we're good.
Oh my goodness.
So I'm going to go ahead. You're up on the screen, and so I'll just go ahead and back away, and you can have the pan shot of the room. And
Sure.
and then if anybody has any additional questions, we're having them post them on the Today's Meet link. Did you get a chance to get to that link by any chance?
I didn't think to open it, but
Okay.
I certainly have it open.
No problem. And so anyway, we've already given them a little bit of an introduction, and so we're turning it over to you.
Thanks.
Uh-huh.
Hi, everyone. Hi. You guys are, I'm looking at you dead on, and you're looking at my screen. So I have this weird thing where I keep on wanting to like turn my body to like match where your eyes are coming from. So I apologize if I seem out of sorts when I'm looking at you. And I want to say, first of all, how incredibly grateful I am for the opportunity both to talk to you today, but also to be in New Hampshire. My wife, as you may have heard, is 29 weeks pregnant, and we have our babies early in our family, and this one's coming in the next week, it looks like. So it's an incredible kindness that Jen and her team has let me stay here and be with you virtually like this. It's a sadness because I really enjoy working with teachers, and for me, it's an incredible opportunity to share with you the work that we did in the creation of the core and thinking about how you folks will be implementing it there in your schools. Because while the standards have been adopted by 46 states, it really is an opportunity for each school and each district to come up with their own plan. And I think it's really important that you folks know that in the work that we do together today and moving forward, my intention is to truly support you in coming up with the solution that's going to work in your district. And I think that's pretty important to understand that I'm not coming here with a preset conception of what the right answers are. I'm here to help support you folks understand the core and understand how that's going to play for you folks in your environment. I think you have a little background on me. I'm happy to answer any questions that come up today about the creation of the core, about the process by which we came up with the standards and that sort of thing. But I think the best way to kind of grasp the standards and think about how to implement them is to take a look at them. So I'm not sure who's working the clicker in the back room there, if my PowerPoint's up there. But if you could click that forward, and if people could take out the packet that they have from there. The very first handout is the actual anchor standards. And I always like to have a good PowerPoint and handouts because I'm certainly nothing to look at. It's baseball season still up here in New England, and so we're all growing very bushy beards to celebrate the Sox beard team. So this is the anchor standards that you should have in front of you. Could everyone just take one moment and read anchor standard number 1? And then once you've read it, turn to a partner at your table. I'd like you to have a brief discussion with them. What do you notice about anchor standard number 1? This is the very first standard. Of all the standards, this is the one we put first. What does it say? What's the meaning there? What words and phrases leap out at you? You can raise your voices, it's okay. I want you guys to talk. This session that we've set up for you folks, it's a working session. I'm a teacher. I'm a classroom teacher. I'm about to, step into my classroom after a half hour with you folks and keep talking with folks there and my students, doing the exact same thing that I'm training you folks to do. And our session today is nothing if it's not going to be a teacher-led session. So jump right in. Let's have that conversation on our tables. What does that standard say?
David, I think they've had some time to process.
Good. So I'd love to hear actually what you said. If people could speak up good enough so I could hear them. What things leapt out at you? I'm going to have to ask people to use their best teacher voices to project themselves, and also use their best teacher awareness around the room, because I simply can't call on you.
Lisa, what were you saying? To read closely. Did you hear that, David? She said to read closely.
Yeah, I could hear her.
Okay.
Let's stay there for a second. Yeah. Right? This is the very first standard we wrote. We could have had any other standard there. And these are the very first words we wanted you to encounter. And let me just make it very clear, it wasn't an accident. If you wanted to boil the standards down to 2 words, it really would be read closely. But now, it's helpfully unpacked about what that means. 46 states got on board, Arkansas got on board with this definition of what it means to read closely. What is that? Let's keep talking.
What the text says explicitly.
David,
What the text says explicitly. Absolutely. So they have to be able to go into the text and find what it says in there. And I think that's a crucial element for them to be able to demonstrate comprehension. There's an and though. And I feel, and I worry when talking to teachers that if we don't pay attention to what's on the other side of the and, we miss a big part of the standards.
Students have to learn how to read text repeatedly each time, pulling back a new layer of understanding. The first time, it may to get an understanding of how it's structured. The second time would be to get what's explicitly stated, and then the third time might be to analyze how the author or what the author did, or deeper understanding, basically.
There's a magic word in the standards for that deeper understanding. Can anyone tell me what it is?
Inferences.
Inferences. And I think that's a crucial element there, that the standards don't get reduced to an activity of just doing a bunch of right there kind of pointing exercises, where they just go and find that evidence and then come back and find that evidence and come back, but they actually have to tie the evidence together and make bigger cognitive jumps to actually pull the things together and create their own intentional structures about the meaning of text. Now, we like that idea so much that we used a semicolon and stated it again. I have to say, as a person who helped write the standards, it really bothered me, that semicolon, and I worked really hard to get rid of it for many, many times. But finally, I made my peace with it, because I thought that there was something very interesting about what happened in the second half of that statement. I like the use of the word evidence, for instance. I thought evidence told teachers a little bit about how this whole document would get read. That our students are going to have to read texts like detectives. They're going to need to go into a text, put on their best thinking cap, and figure out ways to go into it and discover meaning, both when writing and when speaking, to support the conclusions drawn from their reading. Which means explicitly, that opening statement says there's a clear logical link between the activities of reading and the activities of writing and speaking. That there's an integrated whole right out of the gate in the standards. And I think that's just an essential point to note for that. That becomes a kind of a key lead-in for our understanding there today. And I guess I'd really like ourselves to do the following. If we're saying as teachers that we're going to hold students accountable to these standards, then in our work here today, I would really love us to hold ourselves accountable to standard number 1. That when we talk and when we speak and when we do the activities, and we've got a lot of activities planned today, that we hold ourselves to doing close reading, that we hold ourselves for writing evidence, that we tell what's right there, and we make difficult inferences, knitting what's right there together into a coherent whole. I think that's a reasonable expectation, and one that really makes sessions go well together, is to really push ourselves and push our learning. That this is a safe place to be wrong, to ask lots of questions, but to do the work that we need to do in order to kind of understand these standards. Let me ask you to take one more glance then. Let's practice this by reading standard number 10, the bottom of the page. Anchor standard number 10. Have a close conversation with the person at your table about this standard. Read it closely. What would you see that's right there? What inferences would you make after reading it? share back with me what close reading of that standard means? And I'm a classroom teacher, so I'm very comfortable with wait time.
David, I have a question for you.
Sure.
This piece that says complex literary and informational text. In Arkansas, we are used to working with, literary content and practical text. Does informational include then, will it include both content and practical?
So then, my question back is, just so I'm making sure I'm understanding you, give me an example or two of a practical text.
Manuals, recipes, lab instructions.
Okay, those are absolutely practical texts. The op-ed page of the local newspaper, right? The
Yes.
program for the Arkansas football game.
Yes.
These are practical texts, and they're also informational texts. Anything that is of a non-fiction quality, memoirs are informational texts, right? There's a broad definition of informational text located on page 33 of the actual standards. But it's an attempt to recognize a kind of unstated truth that doesn't get kind of brought up to the light too much, and that is the following. You and I, in our day-to-day lives, in fact, most average Americans in their day-to-day lives, read about 90% informational text. Informational text as a text structure is actually fairly complex. And we too often take it as simply transparent for our kids to understand how to read a manual that has headings and subheadings and things like that. But actually, kids need to be taught that. And so the Common Core standards say, starting in kindergarten, we want to expose kids to more informational texts. That 1 out of every 2 texts they read should be something as diverse as The Farm at Maple Hill Lane, or stories about volcanoes or the dinosaurs, and moving all the way up to doing other pieces of informational text, because that's the primary place where students build content knowledge. And I have one of these jobs, and frankly, so does everyone else in the room, where we have the opportunity perhaps to read literature and teach literature. But there's not a whole lot of job opportunities available for people who can write 30-page papers on Jane Austen novels. And reading a Jane Austen novel is fantastic. We do continue to stress the literary reading in the higher grades. But it's important that students also get exposed to practical informational texts. And so we ask teachers to include those texts in their teaching. And there's fantastic, high-quality, complex texts at high grade levels as well as low grade levels. You can read George Orwell, and you can read fantastic early grade materials, several examples of which are located in Appendix B. Does that answer your question?
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Okay. So what about my question? Yeah, I've been in classrooms before. I know the whole bait and switch.
Would you repeat your question, please?
It was a close reading of that line, of standard number 10. What is the meaning of it? The close reading says, determine what the text says explicitly. That's text, right? A standard is text. It's informational text, in fact. Now, I asked you to do a close reading of it, and the definition was to read it closely, i.e., tell me what it says explicitly, and make logical inferences from it. Cite specific textual evidence from the standard when writing, or in this case, speaking to me, and to support conclusions that you drew from what you read.
That students have to eventually be able to do it independently.
Absolutely. And our goal as teacher is to create a system where we're doing a gradual release to independence, which is everyone in the classroom knows that the kids that we have in our classrooms right now are not the same kids that are going to be there in May. If we do our jobs right, there's just a different animal up there. And as a result, the encouragement to do that gradual release to independence is so crucial in the way that we do our teaching. Any words puzzle you in that line? one has got to be the notion of complex, right? Like, what does the standards think is complexity? I think that's a fantastic kind of question to get into at some future juncture to come take a look at that. But certainly, I want to know what the standard meaning of complexity is, right? And I think it's important to notice that the standards differentiate between simply reading and comprehending, that there's got to be demonstrations of comprehension. Having kids read a text is all well and good, but unless they can show that they understand it, that's not going to count. And so the work that we're going to do today is an attempt to show you what that kind of close reading looks like, what comprehension looks like, and how students can demonstrate that comprehension. So let me show you another slide here that kind of captures the picture of the standards in a broad form from a teaching perspective. For some reason, I chose a completely inappropriate metaphor of a knife to kind of model this in a classroom setting, sorry. But for you and me, as teachers, I think the best way to approach the standards is to say, if the standards can help me tell me how to choose complex text, how to teach that complex text, and how to assess complex text, then that matches up pretty closely with what I do as a teacher. I've got to put the right materials in front of my students. I've got to figure out ways to teach them such that they understand the materials. And then I got to figure out ways to assess their learning so that I can improve their learning and improve my teaching such that there's greater uptake over the course of the year. Does that match pretty closely to what you guys do in your classrooms? Because that's what's happening up here in New Hampshire. That and shivering because the temperature was 33 this morning.
It was here too, 31.
Oh, good. We're in similar situations. Good. Now, today's session is going to really delve into the issue of the teaching of complex texts. And I want to go and explain what that is in greater detail. So we can click forward and look at that one slide. It is that idea about students building close knowledge of the text through close reading exercises that are going to be facilitated through text-dependent questions. They're the kind of questions we're going to ask students to turn the reading into comprehension and show us through the use of those standards that they can actually perform the types of tasks that we need them to do to make meaning happen, to allow the text to come alive. And to do that, we're going to actually ask them to do this process called close reading. Now, there's a lot of wonderful research on close reading that in Appendix A of the standards that I've rolled down to a single sheet of paper that's in your hands if you flip the page in your packets there, called Close Reading and the CCSS, and there's actually a slide that can come up on the board about that as well. And as we saw with the actual anchor standard, number one, and looking at the other standards there too, a definition of close reading emerges that asks students to pay careful attention to the text, to watch how its meaning unfolds through a detailed process of reading by answering text-dependent questions about it, questions that actually delve into the meaning of the text and show that students actually understand what the text says and what inferences emerge out of it. Which means that close reading is the kind of reading that students are going to be asked to do once they leave school. These are college and career-ready standards. And the folks that helped write the standards included over 100 different colleges and universities weighing in and talking about what students need to do once they leave high school. It also included a huge number of employers for entry-level positions about the kind of reading they need to do in order to make sense of the tasks that they're in front of them. You know, I'm here in New Hampshire, and it just so happens that New Hampshire has the lowest unemployment rate in the country. We're under 5%. And yet there's literally hundreds of jobs in New Hampshire that employers in New Hampshire can't find people to fill. And the number one job actually they can't find in New Hampshire for people to fill is a mechanic. Now that sounds to me slightly odd. If I think about that, a mechanic's position 50 years ago was showing up to work, taking a piece of sheet metal, punching in, and taking that piece of sheet metal and going to a drill press and just going up and down on the drill press each day, punching out. It's great existence, a pension, middle-class job, great for your families. But in New Hampshire, they can't fill that job Because New Hampshire, 50 years later, that job has changed. That job requires going to the Portsmouth Naval Shipyard, taking that same piece of sheet metal, putting it into a computer-driven press, and having a computer mill that piece of sheet metal within 3/1000ths of an inch. Because that piece of sheet metal is going into a nuclear submarine, and Uncle Sam likes his sheet metal just so in his nuclear submarines. And the reason they can't fill that job is that people can't read the manual to program the computer. It's literally a reading comprehension issue. In fact, at the Portsmouth Naval Shipyard right now in New Hampshire, because Uncle Sam absolutely has to have a sheet metal in his nuclear submarines, you can show up for work for 6 months. They won't pay you, but they'll teach you how to read. And if you can read at the end of 6 months, i.e. if you can program their computers and work there, they will give you a job because they're that desperate to have mechanics there. Now, I don't know about you, but I think we can all agree it would be terrific for our graduates to go on to college or to get a good paying job. But right now, the only jobs that they're gonna have in our information economy is one that requires students to read closely. And the standards are designed to identify those particular tasks that colleges, that employers have identified that by the time they leave high school, they need to go and be able to perform. And then scale back those tasks appropriately throughout the grades. And so that means that when you show up at the Portsmouth Naval Shipyard and they hand you the manual and say go, that you have to be able to read that closely without relying on your background knowledge, right? You have to be able to go and make sense of that. That's what close reading's like. You have to be able to open up the newspaper and make sense of what it says that particular time, right? You have to go to the football game and open up the program and say, hey, Brent Bielema, wasn't he the coach formerly in Wisconsin? What's a Big Ten coach doing in the SEC? I have that question a lot myself, but that's another question for another day, right? And also, ultimately, close reading rewards students for reading closely. That means there's a sense of actual engagement when the mystery is still there. Too much of our training has been as teachers to actually decomplexify the text, to tell them all about what they're about to read, to give the game away, and to not let students and not feel comfortable with students struggling. Not to the point of frustration, but to help guide them along and create the appropriate scaffolds that we over time remove such that they are able to read, as the standard said, independently. That's close reading. And so what we're going to do today is practice a series of close reading exercises using the standards. And to level the playing field, we thought that we'd have you start by doing a close reading of chapter 1 of Lewis Carroll's Alice's Adventure in Wonderland. In fact, only the first 4 paragraphs there too. Janet and her team are going to take over at this point and lead you through some close reading examples. I really appreciated the woman who asked me the question about informational text earlier today, and I hope you will continue to ask those questions. I'm going to be rejoining you a little after 2 o'clock your time, and I'll be able to answer those questions, look at the questions, the text meta questions, and the close reading you performed, and give you some feedback about that, and continue the conversation as we move forward. But I've got to go skedaddle to my classroom. I so appreciate you being here today. I hope you find the time valuable, and I really look forward to working with you this afternoon. Janet, are you okay at this point to take over?
Yes, thank you so
Thank you,
much. We
David.
can't wait to see you back.
Thanks.
We really wish you were
See you
here,
soon.
but, thanks.
So sorry.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Yeah, the only reason he says Janet and his team is because I picked him up from the airport. So, I mean, they took him back, so I think he, associates me with this. But really, I think, Mary, there she is. It was really Mary's, Bridgeport's contact that is how we got to know David Pook. So can y'all not just see what a wealth of information he is, and just, someone that actually sat with a team of writers of the Common Core and can explain to us, and he will be here this spring. I don't know when. We're gonna wait until his baby's born and figure out when that is. So, but Carrie and I didn't feel like, at this point, we didn't want to not bring to you some information he brought to us, because it's such good information that we're going to give you what we got from him as best that we can. We have a lot of notes that he has given us, so we may be reading in between to make sure. It's like every word he sent us, we just can't put in our brains because there's a lot of information he sent us. But we are going to do our very best. So I think it'll be a good day, it's gonna be a good working day. The day we did it, we left tired because you have to think a lot and we'll be, doing a lot in here. So, and really, please take advantage of the today's meet. Any questions you have for him, I think we need to just, anything, and it may be a question that you get answered later in the day, but that's okay. I mean, we need to, that way he can be checking on us today as well. So, okay.
All right, so actually, we would like you to actually take a look at that handout that he stopped at. We want you to take some time at your tables. We want you to read the handout closely, and then we want you to think about the following things. What is different about close reading as compared to the other forms of reading instruction that we've had, and the other forms of reading instruction that we carry on in our classrooms? And also, what are the implications of close reading for literacy instruction, not just in language arts, but also in science and social studies and other technical areas? So go ahead and read through that a little bit more. I want you to have some table discussion about that.
And anything else, this is your stuff, write all over. If you want clean packets later on, we can get that to you. So please write all over this. We can give you other sheets if you want to share it with your faculty. So.
This is going to be a work processing.
Yeah.
You're reading the close reading and the CCSS, the one that's up here on the slide.
Hey, one quick note, thing to help y'all understand what we did. If you notice, the PowerPoint is numbered, and then on the bottom of each page it says slide and whatever. We thought that would be the easiest way for you to figure out which slide it goes with, so you'll be able to correspond. Instead of numbering these 1 through 50 or whatever it is, it has the slide on it, so you'll know which slide we're on. So right now we're on the slide page that has the slide 5 at the bottom.
Continue the conversation, we want to make sure that we understand our norms for today. It is a work day, it's a work session, so we want to make sure that if you need something, you go ahead and get up, take care of it. Make sure our phones are on silent, and try to make sure that our table talk is focused on the topic at hand. Okay? Are there any other norms that you think we need to have in place? So now that you've had a little bit of a chance to read through this document, which by the way is full of information, when I first started looking through it, I started with one color highlighter and then went back with a different color highlighter, and then I ended up highlighting the whole page and had to make another new copy because there's just a lot of information in there. So what are some of the things? Go ahead and talk at your tables about what are the differences between close reading as compared to other forms of reading instruction. I wish I had that in the tape. Go ahead and talk at your tables. Some of our big ahas during our conversations at our tables.
And something I really would like for us to do is if you haven't logged into today's meet, please do, because that is such a great place for us to record. So there was an email that Carrie sent you, and I just did it. It's really easy. You log in, and it asks your name, and that's what all you have to do. And then you can just log into that blue part. It'll pop up. So all these great comments will be a record of our thinking. Plus, it will really help us with our conversations, because we over here had a couple of great ideas, and I would love for that to be. It's going to get lost if we don't get it recorded. So, okay, questions or not questions, but comments on this on what we just talked about close reading.
Obviously, the shift is the background knowledge. We have been background knowledge of these kids instead of letting them discover. And we discussed at this table, where's that fine line? You've got to give them enough to hook them, but you don't want to give it away.
Right.
And so
And then, and I think that would be a great question to ask David Pook would be, how do we know when it's too much? How do we know when background information is too much? And I think we know the answer to that, but we don't always. I mean, it's when we're giving them too much of the
story.
Yeah,
or the
I know
plot.
my book club recently wanted to read the book about Malala. What's her name?
Malala.
Yeah, and I watched the 2020 special, and I thought, I don't need to read the book. I just saw the whole special. So I thought about that with me with background information. That why would I want to go ahead and read something when I already found out all I need to know? Well, probably more good stuff in there, but so.
Well, it's easier to think about how to do a hook for something like Malala or Pioneer Days, and you show a clip of a movie. The harder thing is doing something about our Constitution. What it would be a great hook to make them go in and, that's not something we generally have movies about.
It's true.
Or physical science or chemistry or, that's not something that's easy to find, that hook that allows them to get interested and engaged, but that helps them to build their background.
And I think you can also lead that engagement piece with a really good question. So, if you can build a question that builds in some relevancy for the learner, that natural curiosity can be the hook in itself if you can't find necessarily something to back that up as a picture or a video track.
I think that's what part of close reading is letting the students discover some things on their own instead of us feeding it to them. And so they may not have the background knowledge initially, but when they start reading a piece, then things may come into their mind that they've connected to or whatever, but it's a kind of some self-discovery there for their own instead of us spoon feeding everything to them.
One of the discussions that we had at this group was kind of what our teachers are kind of thinking about what close reading is, and maybe what we, as we're learning more about it. So what are some of the disconnects right now we see in our buildings when teachers say, oh, I did a close read today? What are some things that we can maybe be looking at so that we can help our teachers move forward? Because that's the whole point here, obviously, is that we're here to learn something we can take back to our building. So does anybody see any disconnects, kind of what they're seeing, but what maybe what you think it should be?
I think they need to get past the knowledge level questions. If they're taking the kids back to the text, they need to get in the higher blooms, because they tend to be more of the knowledge recall type ones, and not more literal instead of the inferencing and that kind of.
So
they're also seeing it as an activity, just like what he was talking about. It's an activity that I need to get through rather than really looking at it for the deeper meaning and really trying to find those other texts to bring in to make that meaning deeper.
They want a worksheet that can be graded that says close reading at the top. Check.
Well,
And it doesn't always lend itself to those deeper discussions if they wanna have a worksheet.
I see the teacher doing more of the work than the kids. Myself
Good point,
included
Dee.
sometimes.
Yeah. She said she sees the teacher doing more work than the kids.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, creating those,
Or even in the thinking process when it's going on. I see the teacher doing more of the putting the idea out there than it coming from the room.
So it's more like a model lesson where they're modeling their own close reading and it's not turned over to the student.
I mean,
Carrie,
yeah.
can I ask that whoever is talking stand up because your voice will project and the rest of us can hear and that will keep us from having to repeat?
Okay.
Sure. Thank you.
One of the things that I, thought, one of the things that David did so well, in just in his 30 minutes we had with him, is that, and so we need to work with our teachers, he does wait time. And he will wait until, cause he asked us hard questions, and he wasn't gonna answer them for us. So we all sat here awkwardly for a few minutes, and of course, I'm sitting there wanting to say, I'll give you an answer just so we can go on, but, I didn't wanna do that. But, that's something we gotta really work with our teachers on, is we've got to give them that when we ask those hard questions, and I know Carrie and I have been doing some visits in classrooms, and I've noticed, because teachers feel like they have to cover so much material that if they ask a question, it's not answered, then they'll answer it for them. And that's an age-old problem. This is not new stuff. So, but just to keep in mind that close reading really, if we work with our teachers on that, it's something we need to point out to them.
All right. Are there any additional comments or statements at your tables that you thought were, yes, Shelley?
I think the actual process of doing a close read is new to our teachers. And you can set that up so that you can do it all in one day, or you can do 15-minute chunks throughout the whole week. And the fact that you use the same article over and over and over again, and then you have your students talk about, well, how did you annotate that? Well, I highlight, or I underline, or I circle, or I have a little key at the top. We have students that have created a key at the top, or a little symbol for a word I don't know, or whatever.
Kind of their own function for annotation.
They do, and so, even talking about how you actually annotate a close read, is another part of that process. And if you don't follow the process, you leave out really important chunks.
I think getting them to use the same text multiple times is hard because they feel like they're beating a dead horse. And they feel like the kids are getting bored with it. So getting them to use it multiple times for different reasons is hard.
One of the things I have found, though, in using multiple texts and some of the demonstrations we've been through, if you have good questions, the kids discover so much about that text that the whole time they go, I didn't know it said that. I've done that. We had Timothy Shanahan do a text the first time I read it, and then the second time. That's what we need to help our teachers do with those text-dependent questions that we'll work on later, is that layering of questions where you get the kids discover more and more and more about the text. It's rather than just a first read where they go, but oh, I didn't realize it said that. So
I think you also have to make sure that the text is worthy of reading
yes.
closely, because if they're beating a dead horse, it's probably not an appropriate text.
Well, and if every time they do it, they have a worksheet to fill out, the kids are gonna get bored.
yeah, that's true. Melissa?
I was just gonna go back to where you talked about the privilege of background knowledge, because he says that is something that they shouldn't go to first. A lot of our kids don't have it anyway, but then he said take them back to the text and then basically pull out those tools of finding the meaning in context, prefixes, suffixes. So that goes back to some of the things that our kids don't have and need, which is that vocabulary building, and then being able to struggle with
looking at something and pulling it out, putting it back in, or substituting, all those kinds of skills before they lean on that, as he said, the privilege of the background knowledge. Because unless they struggle with the text in some way, then they're not gonna actually have that close reading. But at the same time, eventually, if they can't do it that way, they'll go to that background knowledge. So a lot of our teachers, I guess, need to build in more of that vocabulary so that they have that tool to be able to go back to the text rather than refer to something they already know.
Sure.
I think, another part of this too is asking the right questions. And when a teacher stands before a group of students and you're thinking on the fly, a lot of times the questions aren't the quality that they should be or at the level they should be. And so, the teacher looking at that close read, writing questions out to the side as they annotate or whatever that they want to ask, and having that Bloom's taxonomy or the knowledge depth chart, having those there so that you ask those kind of questions that instigate the synthesis and the analysis of the piece is a real critical part.
Right, you're right.
And, we were just talking over here, how long has it been since we've done questioning strategies with teachers? And, if you go back to the stuff that we did with Doug, we talked about 6 different kinds of questions. When we look at, checking for understanding, we talked about different kinds of questioning. So really going back and tapping into the resources that we already have, and bringing that back up in front of the teachers. But it really is, Doug has told us, you cannot expect or think that those higher order questions are just going to happen. It's the purposeful planning that happens behind that, and planning for how to move across the levels. And you might not get to the top, but you're certainly not going to get there if you haven't planned ahead. So really spending time talking about that at your buildings.
And so much of what y'all have said today is really, it just is exactly what vocabulary we're gonna talk about today. We're gonna talk about how to write text-dependent questions. We're gonna be looking at the standards to be writing text-dependent questions. A lot of that is what we're gonna be working on today. So you guys are, Lisa, I can't remember who it was, I just read a Today's Me question on, would he talk more about how not having background information up front levels the playing field for our struggling readers. And we'll talk about that for just a second, because that is something he really hit on. And if you were at his training, raise your hand. There was a few of us there at the first training. One of the things, please help. You guys were there, so you gotta help. Jump in. Go ahead.
Just one thing that when Melissa was talking about vocab, just looking at the elements, and I think over time I've recognized this, and we've talked about this quite a bit. I think close reading has been such an emphasis because it really is central to all parts of the ELA standards. We don't really get into, I don't know that we've ever talked about the language standards, or we've looked at, which include vocab and the different conventions. And we really don't talk about speaking and listening, but when we really have a complete close read that includes the elements that are pointed out, it gets at all of those standards. And I think that making sure that we are really strengthening what we do with close reading and its instruction will help us to really engage students in all ELA standards. And I think that's what, I feel like people might be getting tired of, close read. But if we emphasize all of those standards, then it becomes much more important.
And I think we need maybe not just focus on close reading on ELA, but branching out into
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. Hey, I am teaching content, but I'm also teaching kids how to get through this content by doing a close reading. That it all fits together.
Right, because just like David said earlier, it's all about creating those literate graduates so that when they do get out into the workplace or they do get to college, no matter what text is presented to them, they know how to figure out what's going on with that text and actually apply that information. So you're exactly right. Okay, so if there's any other additional comments that you would like to make that you did not necessarily feel like sharing, you can post them up on our Today's Meet, as well as, go ahead and write them down on a piece of paper, because we may come back to those. What we're going to do now is we're going to shift a little bit. We're going to let you get some practice. So if you could turn to the next page in your packet, which is an excerpt from Alice in Wonderland by Lewis Carroll. And what we want you to do is we want you to closely read this piece with two things in mind. Think about how do you attack a text, and also how do you annotate to help you with making meaning of that text. So go ahead and closely read it.
Say that again.
How do you annotate to help you with making meaning? And how do you attack the text? How did you annotate? How did you annotate? What was your thinking process when you were looking at this piece of text? Anybody want to share?
Underlining things that stood out.
Okay.
Words that I thought were important.
Hey guys, everybody. I know you're very Okay, Dory, I'm sorry, could you repeat that again?
I think I just underline things that stand out, circling words that I feel are important to my understanding, and make notes in the margins.
Okay. Anybody else?
Hey Melissa, will you tell, what you, I went back there and I liked what you said earlier. Is that the Shabani?
Yeah. She has where, when they annotate, they write directly on there, and they question the text, they post, have reactions, opinions, connections, they relate if they were in that situation. And then I added, predict, visualize, and summarize, or they could even, if it's appropriate for what they're looking at, actually draw a little icon or a picture if that helps them, because they'll do that when they're doing like a vocabulary foursquare. But, if they were annotating like a prompt, you know, you can have them circle the command words, to make sure that they understand that even though it doesn't have a question mark, you know, which they'd circle all punctuation, that it might be asking something, and therefore if they're annotating for the command words, they'll know that it doesn't necessarily have to have a question. And so that's what I use, and it works pretty good.
So what you're saying is, no matter what, those students really have a purpose and a function when they're engaging in that text, and therefore that's kind of their lens that they annotate through.
Yes.
And so when we think about this from a teacher perspective, we really want to make sure two things. First of all, that the students get a chance to engage with the text without a lot of that background information. We just gave this to you and told you to try to work your way through it, try to figure out what was going on. We want our students to be able to get that practice under their belts. But at the same time, we also as teachers want to make sure that we go through the close reading process. Because if we don't experience the close reading process, it makes it hard for us to make sure we know where our students are thinking and what our students need to be thinking about if we ourselves haven't gone through it. Which goes back to what Leslie was saying about the worksheets. You know, if you have not taken the time to really develop those questions yourself with those different purposes in mind, if you haven't taken the time to analyze that text so you know maybe where those conversations are going to lead, it's a little bit harder to get to that depth with your students in the text if you haven't gone through the process yourself. So his little words of wisdom were that teachers need to go through close reading so that they understand how their students go through close reading.
And I was just thinking that and I don't know, it may be just me in my building, but we do a better job of doing the annotating on nonfiction text than we do the literary text. And because personally, when I read a book, for a literary book, I don't annotate in it. I mean, I do.
English major.
I mean, I do have all these strategies running through my mind, but I don't put it down on paper. But we have to connect these literary pieces with a nonfiction companion. And so we're gonna have to learn how to annotate and compare these texts that are two different genres.
Right.
And that's something we have to learn.
Yes.
Well, but Leslie, I will say, as far as like junior high,
They annotate literary.
They do.
It's much
Then
more
at the
difficult.
elementary
It's
level,
building,
we need
yeah.
to start teaching
We
them how to do
it
that.
in junior high, we annotate literary text in junior high.
And we need to start.
Might be the only text.
Probably just the opposite. I think that the annotation of literary passages starts getting at standards 2 through 9. And so we start looking for things like word choice, and we ask kids, what words did the author use? And those are things English, I mean, that's very general, but that's what English majors do. And I know that seems silly, and like you said, you're not gonna go out and be an English major, hang up a sign and say, I'm
But see,
English.
those are questions that you can't easily answer on a worksheet.
Right, but those are things that you can annotate for with time.
And it does take time because, and like you were saying about establishing that purpose. If you know going in what you want that purpose to be because you've already closely read that text and you know what you want to pull from it to make sure the students can get to that same level of understanding, if you pull the literary text and the informational text and you see those direct connections and you try to build through questioning to get them to see those connections as well. Yes?
When we teach annotation, we talk about how a lot of people think of it as just a reading strategy, but it's a thinking strategy, because a lot of people disengage when they read, so therefore there goes the comprehension. But when you're annotating, and I tell students, then you are engaged, because you're talking to the text.
Definitely. And you're right, and it is a way of showing your thinking while you're processing through that piece of text.
As far as the fiction or the literary, we've used a lot of poems.
Yeah.
And poems are really good because they're deep, they're at many levels, they uncover many, the right there, the meaning, the point of view, the mood.
Word choice.
There's a lot of things
Yeah.
in poetry that is really good, and we've done that a lot in third grade.
Yeah.
Especially it ties back to the standard of authors choose specific words.
Right.
To create, the tone that they want to create. And we even, what if you'd have chosen this word instead of that word? Would it make a difference? And I've even had second graders who were like, oh yeah, that is a better word.
And then it ties into modeling writing too, because, and that's why, I mean, I know we do those things, but I don't think we're necessarily thinking about how we're doing it. Yeah.
Carrie, we're trying to create independent readers. I heard the discussion of we need to set a purpose for reading with very good text-dependent questions as they're reading. And I would think that we need to help them learn how to create their own text-dependent questions that they can start to become more independent in that by the end of the year, to where they can collaborate and say, okay, this is a question I had while we're reading. And they begin to discuss that at the beginning of the year. Let me show you some text-dependent questions I had, but by the end of the year, what are text-dependent questions you had?
And I think that it could eventually evolve into the students pulling their own ideas and coming up with their own questions through that process. But as our students encounter more and more complex text, the idea that they could do it independently while also holding onto the cognitive load of a complex text makes it a little bit trickier for them. So you want to have that scaffold, that text-dependent question there if it truly is that complex of a text. Hopefully that skill will transfer over, so when it is an independent text, when it is something that's on their level, they have that thinking behind it. But they aren't necessarily having to struggle with developing a question and synthesizing the complex.
So what you're saying is that when you look at those three levels of text complexity, if it's a readily available text to them, they could struggle through creating their own text-dependent questions, but once they get into that highly complex text, they need some more support in thinking about the text.
And you definitely want to have them, because it's a new skill. So you want them to have as much practice with you scaffolding that idea and that questioning process. And it's not so much that you want them to be able to come up with a text-dependent question as much as you want them to be able to think through that text at that deep of a level that the scaffolding of the question is allowing for. Does that make sense? Any other questions? Yes.
And I keep coming, and I put this on today's meeting because I've modeled close reading in all grades, actually. And, I'm struggling with our population, which is high ELL,
and we've got several kids who are pre-K readers in 3rd grade. When is an appropriate time to put that complex text in front of a student? Is there a magic reading level that they need? Because, you know, you put it in front of them and I can model it, and I think that's great that they're seeing it, but when do we actually say, okay, now you do it?
And that's a very good question, and actually, Mary's department has been working, in addition to this David Pook work, they've also been working with a woman named Diane August. And her specific focus has been on sheltered students and sheltered classrooms and ELL 1s and 2s, and even 3s and 4s. But really trying to develop those scaffolds before they encounter the text, to give them enough information to kind of aid them through the text, so that when they do come to it, they have a little bit more that they need to bring to the text, because they don't have maybe that academic or that vocabulary knowledge.
What if they can't read the text at all, though? If they're on a DRA 4 and we're in 4th grade reading.
I will say right now, I totally understand what you're saying, but I think that's a whole nother workshop. Because I think today, we need to figure out this, and then I think, and they're here, so as, you know, we may want to bring that up in you know, sometime in the future, because I think that's a problem for everybody in this room. Because even if you're a 9th grade teacher, you've got kids at 4th grade level, what do I do? So I think that is something that Mary's going to tell us how to do it right now.
Well, no, I'm not gonna. I just want to make a comment that, a student that is at that level obviously needs intervention other than what is happening in that mainstream classroom. But I was at Jones a week or so ago, and it was almost all, I think there was one Caucasian kid, it was almost all ELL. And we watched a teacher do a close read with this group of kids, and when I first looked at the text,
Who's been through this training?
I thought, I'm not sure what this text is talking about. She took them through, she did a close read with those kids, and she used this model that we'll share. And those kids, it was amazing to me. Their rear ends were up in the air, their heads were together, they were talking about the text, and by the time that she finished, it was probably a 45-minute lesson. Those kids understood the text. I mean, I was amazed.
When do you just say, okay, now your turn? Because
well, this was close reading instruction. This was not independent, they were reading on their own.
that's what I'm wondering, is when do we give it to them to let them grapple and
This was
not?
the instruction on how to do a close reading.
This was instruction, she was teaching them how to closely read the text. And it was a pretty amazing thing. If anybody wants to get out and watch this teacher, let me know and I'll share her name. She has people come into her classroom all the time to watch. It's pretty phenomenal.
The support came as she posed the question.
Yeah, the
for them to
questions
grapple with.
were this.
She
So,
supported the
but they
kids'
did all the
vocabulary as well. I mean, I know that there were low-level L's in that class. I mean, there's no way at Jones Elementary that all those kids are high-level L's. But it was pretty amazing. In addition, though, obviously those kids need small group reading instruction if they're in a DRA 4. But those kids could still, everybody could participate in the conversation. And they shared reading, and they read together, and they did a lot of discussion about the text. But they understood, and they did, you know what? They did one paragraph of text, but those kids understood what that text was saying. And I think that's one of the things that we have to remember is we're not talking about long passages. We're talking about chunks and kids getting in and learning how to read difficult text.
And that's where, at the secondary level, our teachers start having a hard time spending 45 minutes on a paragraph of text when they've got all of this content covered. Right. So that's going to be the hardest buy-in, I think, at our level, is trying to get these teachers to see that there may be a need for this. But how do you balance that? How do you balance the time it takes to read a paragraph to getting covered what they need to be covered?
Well, I think we have to quit having the conversation of covering content. I mean, because my question would be in a
Okay,
district
get rid
like.
of those EOCs.
But in a district our size, if you're covering content and 95% of your kids are L's, what percentage of those kids, maybe it's been covered, but how much have they truly learned? And how deep have they really gone with everything?
Melanie, I
that's been
think that,
covered?
to me, the answer to that question is, and I totally understand because they do have a lot they're trying to teach the students. So, but they have to understand that and that's why they have to be very selective about what passage they choose, because whatever passage a teacher chooses needs to be rich enough that because of the instruction they're giving them, that they can hopefully read the rest of what they're supposed to read more independently than they would have before. And that's how I would pose it to your teachers. If it's their science textbook or an article or whatever they're doing, the whole purpose of a close read, period, is that we get them to independent. So if we never teach them how to really read a text, they're never going to get to independent, period.
It's
So,
kind of like when you set up your behaviors and expectations at the beginning of the year. These are the classroom procedures. You spend a good amount of time on that to make sure that things run smoothly for the rest of the year. It's that same idea. You put that really good work in for that small piece of text, but then it's going to pay back in the future with their constant connection to text. Right?
And I understand that, but I also know that classroom teacher.
yeah.
You know,
Oh, yeah.
you know, that's a hard buy-in. That's jumping off into the unknown for them. And that's really tough when you've got a biology EOC you have to be accountable for.
Well, and we don't expect teachers to do close reading, biology teachers to do close reading every day. I mean, that.
Right.
I think a good goal, and didn't we say one time that if a student in the secondary schools had a close read once a week or so, and maybe more in language arts, in every subject, that would be a good goal, you know, and that way they're getting that close read instruction at least 5 times in a week. Okay, I need to, yeah, okay.
We can talk about this all day.
Questions? Hang on just a sec, Shelley, real quick, and then we'll move
Well,
on
I
to this.
just wanted to say, you know, you can use a speech, you can use, you know, an article, you can use anything to do a close read that's specifically tied to the content, that after the close read, you can generate your conversation and move forward with whatever your content is. You know, there are resources out there.
Yeah, and they're using those, I know they are, they just, I mean,
Yeah,
I've seen it, so,
Yeah,
yeah.
but it's just one of
I
those
know.
balancing acts that's very hard.
Yeah, it is. Okay, we're gonna go now to, the next, in your packet, the text-dependent questions in the Common Core slide. So we've kind of talked about close reading. We're not gonna get into the details of close reading until really probably November 1st, because our real goal today is we've got a close read kind of under our belt, not really under our belt, but we know what we're talking about. But we really want to get to that level of how do we learn how to write good text-dependent questions, because that's our purpose and our goal for today. So if you will look at, it is, all of the next couple of slides have to do with the Alice in Wonderland passage, and he just kind of used that as his teaching on text-dependent questions. So look at your packet, it says slides 7 and 9 at the bottom. These are things that he has already said, we know. They draw, text-dependent questions draw the reader back to the text to discover what it says. They have concrete and explicit answers that do not rely on a mix of personal opinion, background information, or imaginative speculation. And you're going to look at, and I think you've probably been through these exercises before, it's not a bad thing to do it again, where we look at what is a text-dependent and what is not a text-dependent question. We're going to look at that at this point. Right now, look at though, before you do that, look at this page where it says what are text-dependent questions, the sheet in your packet. And just want you to read that kind of like you did the other one to yourselves for a few minutes, annotate it. And I want you just to be thinking a little bit about what this has to say and any points that you might want to bring up after you read what this says about text-dependent questions. Yeah. But what are some things that this said to you? Anything you want to bring up that you thought was important information that you kind of went, aha, or maybe, oh, I remember this, or this is important? What are some things about text-dependent questions that you learned from this handout? Or even looking at the non-text dependent, you might want to just go on to that one. Okay.
to me, the one thing that came out was at the very top of the handout. In that first paragraph, it talks about standards 1 and 10, and then also standards 2 through 9, and how it said that standards 1 and 10 are, about closely reading, providing evidence from a complex text, drawing inferences based on that text, what it explicitly says, but then standards 2 through 9 reveal that the variety of tasks that they can call on students to perform all critically rely on consulting the text for answers. So knowing that as we go through all those other standards, it still is going back to the text and critically thinking about that text.
Carrie, a question that
Yes.
I put on there, I know you're pulling on, but was Meredith and I were talking about it over here, the line that says concrete and explicit answers are rooted in the text. Does that mean there's always a correct answer to a text-dependent question? Because we've always been taught, don't ask questions where there's
a right
answer.
That's a good question. Ask that one.
I did.
I would say yes, there is always a right answer.
If you look at the last.
But there may be more than one right answer, but it's let me tell you something I have seen.
Evidence
Yeah.
is the key.
Yeah.
Whatever your answer is, you have to have
So
evidence.
if you
to
have the
support it.
evidence to support that thinking, to back that, kind of like a lawyer, if you have the evidence to back up your argument, that kind of an idea, I think that you can defend it. However, when we talk to David later today, we'll see what he's thinking about it, because I think there could be degrees of correctness maybe, in a way.
Well, Meredith and I were talking about the question about what does the reader know about the rabbit? And she said, well, she was inferring that he was, I'm talking for you. That he was, kind of an uptight rabbit with the way, oh dear, And I said, well, I'm looking at that question thinking, well, I know he's got a pocket watch, he's a talking rabbit, and he's late for something. I mean, those are.
That concrete pieces of evidence.
But I think you just said
How
it.
deep you take it.
Well, but you also could back up what you just said, both of you, by evidence. So really, it's not that there's necessarily only one right answer, but if you can defend your answer, justify it by text, then it's correct.
And you've made a logical inference based on that text. And that's kind of where I got hung up too, is that if the answer was right there in the text, I would say, well, that's just a literal question, and we're gonna have all these teachers asking what color was his shirt on Tuesday.
Right.
And then they can say blue, and that's where I had trouble with, so what is, but, because I think we touched on it a little bit when he was here the first time, and he talked about logical inferences based on evidence from the text. You would not be able to ask that question about the rabbit if you had not read the text. Does that make sense?
Because you don't know any talking rabbits, I don't think.
But for you to say that rabbit is kind of uptight, you had to read the text. You would not be able to answer that with that.
Right.
So you've got a combination of text evidence, I had to read the text, go back to it, and then make a logical inference, so that can still be a text-dependent question. That's how I understand it. I think we still need to ask him, of course, but that's.
Okay.
Well, and he says right here, I'm gonna read you what he says. At some point, some participants may be wondering to themselves, text-dependent questions look a lot like lower-level questions to me. Some educators might call these right there questions. It is therefore important to stress that while text-dependent questions can be used to help students identify key details in complex text, text-dependent questions can also ask students to make logical inferences, draw conclusions, support arguments based on what the text says. So, so that is exactly what we were talking about.
And I think
there.
that's
So
the.
we have, or is that something that he sent you?
It's what he sent me, but I can, you know what, we can give you the link to all this other stuff, because, he wrote a lot of things on this thing called the Aspen Institute, where we got a lot of information, so we'll be more than happy to share that with y'all. There's quite a bit of good
And
stuff
I
there.
really think that's the heart of the entire issue of text-dependent questions. You just hit the heart of it, because schools are saying they're using text-dependent questions, and I've seen a lot of lower-level questions that they can yank that answer right out of the text. And that is not what we're talking about. You may have to start there, especially with our L's. You may have to start there to make sure they have those key ideas, but that is definitely not where we're going with text-dependent questions.
And so the direct connection to text-dependent questions, this is actually pulled from the Park document, so that you can see that This is going to be something that will be looked at and most likely assessed during our upcoming park assessments in the
When we
future.
pulled this off the park, we looked at it and we said, I'm not sure what, it's kind of like, which came first, the chicken or the egg. I don't know if David Pook wrote these or had a hand in it, because it's very much what he, I know he's working with Hart, very much like what or if this was written and he used it, but it is mirrored what he is telling us and what Park is telling us. So if you had, obviously everybody has already bought into this because we know this is what we're doing, but we also know Park will be assessing us the exact same way. So, but, go ahead, yeah.
So if you look at those non-text dependent questions versus the text dependent questions, you can see that there's a definite connection. Those that are text dependent questions have the reader go back to the text to find the information, to explicitly defend their answer, or to take the evidence and infer the answer. The non-text dependent questions are usually based on personal opinion or somebody's background experience. And so we want to make sure that we lean that way and we try to get rid of the idea of, how do you feel about this book? Those kinds of questions, which in the past we've had a lot, especially at elementary, we did a lot of text-to-self connections. And so we're trying to shift away from that, and we're trying to look at text-to-text connections, text-to-world connections as being our focus rather than those text-to-self connections.
And one other thing, and I've tried to find it, and maybe later on another slide, I'm going to mention it now, because we've talked about background. One of the things that he pointed out in somewhere else, I couldn't find it exactly, but look at that first question. Are books without pictures or conversations useful? That was non-text dependent. We could have a discussion about that. Or what kind of books does Alice find useful? But he said, and I know this as a teacher, at some point before we ever got to Alice in Wonderland, we would say, oh, Alice didn't like books very well. And then had the students go find the evidence. We already gave away the secret. So that's kind of that background information sometimes where teachers tell too much and it takes away all the discovery for the student. So when you're really trying to work with teachers on what's too much background information, if it's giving away the secret of the text, it is too much background information. If it is getting them ready, like a history, like a constitution, you may have to give them some background so they understand where it even came from and why it was written. But, so I think that's a good distinction there.
So we're going to take you through a practice text. We're all very familiar with the Gettysburg Address. And so what we'd like you to do is read the Gettysburg Address, or recite it to yourself if you've memorized it in the past. And then we want you to go ahead and see which of these questions you think are text-dependent questions and which ones are not. And that's all on that next page of your handout. Finish up your tabletop. Good conversation. Okay, so when we look at these questions, we'll go ahead and do like a show of hands. Does that work for everybody? Okay.
Okay, guys, y'all ready? We're going to take a break after this. So,
Yes, we are.
Yeah.
You've been working hard. So question 1, how many of you think, what are the people who are assembled at Gettysburg there to do? How many of you think that's text dependent? Raise your hand. Thank you.
What are they assembled to do?
Dedicated portion of the field on the resting place of those games.
So you have to go back to the text by hand? Text dependent. Okay, what about number 2? No, that's one of those text to self. We love those questions. What about number 3?
Yes.
And what is the answer to that?
Continue fighting for what they were fighting for. Continue to fight.
Dedicated to the great task remaining before us.
So again, back to the text to find the information. Okay, number 4. No, it's tricky because it's got that quote in there. And a lot of times kids will be like, ooh, quote, that means we're going back to the text. And that's not really what the question is asking. So that's one of those little tricky ones you need to pay attention to. What about number 5?
No.
Okay, this is another one we had a big discussion on when we first had our training. Because of the quotes, pass the test, we thought, oh, maybe that is something in the text, but the truth is that phrase is never in that text. Also, there would have to be a lot of background information because of the wording of the north in that question as well. Okay, what about number 6? Okay. So what was your thinking behind that?
Background knowledge.
Background knowledge, okay. Specifically to what?
On to the why.
To the why. So the reason why he's there?
Yeah.
Okay.
But that goes.
I mean, he tells why he's there.
I think yeah.
If the second part is an inference,
But then it changes.
The second question makes it more of a question.
Right, so that follow-up question is really what brings it
Yeah.
back to the text as your main focus. But he does say in there, you know, why he's there to give the speech.
So you
Okay.
think the second part makes it more text dependent? See, I was
Yes.
thinking it made it less text dependent.
Well, and I think because it's asking you to have how it says Lincoln shifts the focus of his speech from what he says at the end of the second paragraph, the idea that he's having them go back to the second paragraph to kind of think about that.
So it's a why question about why he does that.
but it's an inference that draws on the text.
So you need the text there to pull that information.
With that without looking at
That was one that we discussed a long time with him. And if you have additional questions about it, write it down.
Yeah.
And then number 7, what do you guys think? Text dependent? You can go right through and pull out all those key details. Okay?
One thing I want to say about this text, and one of the things that I have noticed, when I have gone into classrooms and I have been watching, it just happened is I've done some of these GBD walks, and I think I might have mentioned this to some of, but one of the things, I have been in some classrooms where there have been some great discussion about something the students have read. But we've got to work with our teachers because so much of the great discussion was things like, number 4, why is equality an important value to promote? And the kids were so engaged, they had a lot to say about it, but it really never went back to the Gettysburg Address, what they were supposed to be discussing. So as you're working with your teachers, and what happened was when I was in a couple of those classrooms, I mean, I was engaged. I thought, this is great conversation. And then I had to step back and go, but you know what? Any student could be in this classroom right now and be discussing this and never read the text. They never, I mean, because the questions didn't go back to the text. So the teacher needs to be aware of that when they're in discussion. It's okay to have that as a discussion question. That gets kids interested. But the teacher has to have other questions ready to go that are going back to the text so that students can't just be in a classroom with, and our teachers have to be aware that just because the kids are highly engaged, you remember that, we've seen that little clip where the little emoji person says, how did you know it was a good lesson? They liked it. You know, we have to be careful that we want our kids to like it, but we want them to like it with a purpose. So.
And I heard somebody say that's like an essential question, and you're right. And when we have our unit plans with our essential questions, keeping those questions there as a way to promote the conversation is a great way to do that. However, you want to develop additional questions to that essential question to connect that particular text to the essential question. So they can see that and use that textual evidence to help deepen their thinking about it.
And so that when they go back to that question at the end, they can look at other texts and say, oh, and these other texts read about this.
I want to know, excuse me, I wanted to know about question 6. When you all were with him, and he was defending that as being text dependent, you said we had a lot of discussion about that. I think some of the hardest things about being an instructional facilitator is taking what I learned firsthand or secondhand back to them, and by then it's thirdhand, and it's like, well, who are you anyway? You know. And
because we're not 100 miles from home.
Somebody said something about something in some meeting, and now we've all supposed to know and be expert in it.
That's true.
And I'm going, I would like to have been here. So I'm mad at y'all for not inviting me. When you had the L teachers here with Okay, because we knew about everything else, why I didn't take that out. Okay, but what I wanna know is, tell me a little bit more about y'all's discussion on question number 6.
Well, really, the discussion stemmed from the idea that if we're asking, why, then we're asking them to use a lot of background knowledge and their own inferring and thinking about it from an experience that may not be directly connected to the text. Okay? Because of using that word why. That was where the big discussion came from. But then when he led us to understand was that it is explicitly in his speech. He tells you his purpose. We are here, he says why he's there. So that is what leads it back to the text. So that kind of clarified for us. But
Well, the thing that when I was not here, so I'm learning about this myself, but I immediately marked that as a text-dependent question, so it gave me pause when y'all had a discussion about whether it is or is not. Was I wrong to immediately go and know that it was?
You weren't. You weren't necessarily wrong. As a matter of fact, when I went through this, I automatically marked it as text-dependent.
Okay.
But because some people think at it from a different perspective, that's what brought that conversation from the idea that it was not a text.
Well, and I think he also pointed out, because it says at the end of the second paragraph, it led the kids directly back to the text. That was another reason why I think all of us said it's text dependent, and it is text dependent because it did lead you directly. You had to go back. I bet everybody in here, when they did that, you went back to find out, because I didn't know. I had to go back and find out, what is the purpose? Why did he shift it here at the end of the second paragraph? So that was kind of one of those, as you're writing text dependent questions, when your question directly leads them back to the text, then it will be a text dependent question, from what I understand from David Pook, secondhand. So.
Because we have the opportunity to still connect with him and to talk with him again this afternoon. So that's something that we really think we need to go back to, make sure we can
I put it in there.
Because I think you're right, Lana. I think that, and that's actually why we have somebody here videotape today. Because we want those people that were not necessarily here in person to be able to still get that experience, so that, because we do give a lot of information and a lot of the processing is where a lot of the learning comes. And so with that, we're going to give you guys a little bit of a break because you've been doing a lot of thinking. So we're going to take a break from until 10:25, 10:30, somewhere in there. We'll start right back at 10:30, and we'll continue on.
A couple of things came up over break that I want to just maybe relieve some fears. Where are we going with this? Because I know some of y'all are probably thinking, do I have to take this back to my faculty Monday? Let us tell you that, and we probably should have gone through this before we started, but we had David Pook first and we went right in. So very quickly, we'll tell you kind of what we see, how we see this progressing. Today we're going to get through as far as we can. We may not get to as far as because we're already behind, but that's okay because we'd rather have good discussion than to move as fast through this. We will be back again next Friday. And on Friday, our goal is to finish what we haven't finished today. And then we're going to ask for you guys, and we'll let you know more about this, but you're going to, in groups, bring some text with you that teachers are actually going to teach this 9 weeks. So some type of text. So you'll need to kind of look at, you'll be in grade level teams. I'll let you know what grade level teams that you're in, and Carol let K5 know. And you'll work with a couple of people, and you're going to find some text that you know the teachers are going to be using probably in late November, early December, and write text-dependent questions for those. And we'll give you a template and how to do that and that type of thing next Friday. We're going to then send that off to David Pook. And David Pook is going to look over our work. And then on November 11th, we're going to have you come back, and we'll have you in time period. So we'll have like K2 at a certain time, and then 3-5 at a certain time. And we're going to have him via Skype. And it's actually very easy to work with him in a small group. So he might look at 3 different grade levels, text and text-dependent questions, and give a feedback right then. He said he wouldn't be able to do like formal written up feedback. Well, he'll have read them, and he'll be able to have very good discussion with you all. And you'll, just like we did when we did this, you'll change some of your questions, and then at that point, you'll spend some time getting it ready to go for teachers, and we'll give it to teachers to try this text that they're going to use anyway with the text-minute questions that David Pook has looked over with you guys. That's why I'm saying that the text that you choose probably needs to be maybe early December type text. So that's where we're going. So we're not asking you guys to go back and immediately teach teachers how to do this. I think we need to spend time working on it. We need to spend time writing questions. We need time and feedback with David Pook, even if it is via Skype. Sounds like we may get him sooner than we thought if his wife has the baby soon. And
This is all about your learning.
Right.
We want you to take the time to do the learning and processing today. Eventually, we'll get that out there for everyone, but today it's for you guys to be thinking for your own benefit, for your own learning.
And then at some point, we'll get it ready and you can be working with teachers and PLCs, writing text-dependent questions and that type of thing. But that's not the goal of today necessarily. We do not expect you to go back and immediately jump into this with your teachers. So.
We will be back. Did you say the 11th?
Monday?
Yes,
Yeah,
it's on it.
It's on the calendar. Yeah.
Well, it's not on my calendar. Maybe it's on the.
It's on that first sheet we gave you, and I know that it's on that very first sheet.
We've got our UPD things, and then we've got our.
I know, yeah. Let's not talk about calendars, that's a sticky point. Okay.
All right, so let's go ahead and bring the conversation back. We're going to really quick align all of our thinking to the anchor standards. And this, to me, I love this picture, and I believe it was Judy Fox maybe brought it up a couple of years ago. But I really, because of all the new information, I didn't internalize this graphic until David walked us through it when we were meeting. To me, the idea that standard 1 and 10 on this graphic are the supports for all of the other reading standards. That was a huge growth for me. I knew that standard 1 was important. I knew that standard 10 was important, but I didn't realize that they really are the support for every other standard that we have in our anchor standards for literacy. And I like this visual. It was a good way for me to kind of connect my thinking. The idea that we have to make sure that our students are able to extract evidence and make inferences, which is standard 1, and also read complex text, which is standard 10. And then all of those other standards fall in between. So to me, I was looking at standard 1 as being all that literal understanding, that literal comprehension that we have to look at. They have to be able to extract evidence, make inferences, kind of understand what's going on. If they don't understand what's going on, there's no way we can ask them to do any of those other standards 2 through 9. Does that make sense? Okay. So the idea of when he says frame the performance of the intervening anchor standards as relying on the central close reading skill of citing specific textual evidence from complex text, I had to closely read that particular statement because that's a lot of information. But really what he's saying is we need to make sure that we are building in specific questions to address those types of knowledge that are extracted from those standards so that our students are thinking at those levels. Does that make sense? Okay. So when you come down here, we have specific standards for kindergarten. Then it stair steps up to first grade, and it stair steps up all the way up to 12th grade. We need to be aware of the fact that those anchor standards are written the exact same way, but they change a little bit from grade level to grade level. So the teachers that you're working with need to really understand the specific standards that are for their grade level, but also the grade level before and the grade level after. If they are aware of those things, then they know what kind of questions to really develop from the text. Okay? Any questions about that? This is something, honestly, when I first looked at the standards, I thought, okay, that's 10 standards. Awesome. Just like my frameworks in the past. Oh, there's 45 frameworks. Awesome. And so I just thought, okay, well, I'll get rid of the 45, and I'll just move those 10 in their place, and I can just check I did this, check I did this, check I did this, and I'm done. The truth is, these are written differently. These are written for us to practice constantly over and over in different ways with different pieces of text. and different purposes. And never for a teacher to say, oh, I did that, check, and now moving on, and I don't have to go back there again. Which, unfortunately, the way our frameworks had been in the past, a lot of teachers did say, I had covered that framework. And so we want to shift that thinking, okay? Now, he talks about how you can have text-dependent questions at several different levels of specificity. Did I say that right? It's a hard word. He said you can start all the way down at the word and phrases level. You can pull out specific words, specific phrases, ask them about the idea of what's really being said with those words, why those words were chosen, how they shape a tone, or how they develop a character trait, or those types of things. You can bring those questions all the way down to words and phrases. And Janet, jump in if you need. Okay. He also talks about you can have text-dependent questions at a sentence level so that the students are able to look at specifically what is this sentence saying about the character, or what is this sentence saying about the purpose of the author. You're trying to have them look at that sentence level. You can also look at a paragraph level. So you want them to be able to summarize those key events, those key details. You also want them to be able to investigate the structure and transitions within a paragraph as well. So all of these, you can see, are anchored in different standards. And so that leads us to our connection with academic vocabulary. Goes back to those words and phrases and the things that we need to look at for words and phrases. So if you would go ahead and take your packet and flip to the next page that has academic vocabulary and the CCS at the top.
It's kind of, when we look at this, and it's, sometimes it's one of these things when you look at the order of how things are here, you kind of, I mean, it's really hard to figure out what order you want to do things in. So we talked about close reading. We've talked about a little bit about text-dependent questions and what they are and what they're not. We've talked about some ways that you can write text-dependent questions, whether it's through looking at a specific word, and you'll be doing this. You may ask them about specific words. You may ask them about sentences. You may ask them about paragraphs, and you've got, excuse me, the standards that will help you. But really, we need to talk, before we even start writing questions about the academic vocabulary, which we're all, I'm sure, very familiar with, on what they're talking about with academic vocabulary. Actually, if you look in your standards themselves, and I pulled it out last night and made a copy of it, and I'm sure I probably can't find it now. Oh yeah, here it is. In the standards themselves, if you look in appendix, I believe it's, which appendix is it? A, pages 32 through 34, there's a whole section on academic vocabulary that's probably worth reading sometime. Whenever you talk to your teachers about, because it is right here in the standards exactly what we're going to be talking about with academic vocabulary. It is, and if you look at what it says here, especially the middle one, the lack of systematic instruction has been shown to be the leading cause of the achievement gap. The Common Core stresses the importance of contextual instruction around Tier 2 academic vocabulary. That's what we're going to really talk about today, is the Tier 2 words. I know that we're all familiar with that. We're just going to do a little bit of talk about it right now. Do we want him to read this first? Okay, go ahead and read the page that he has on academic vocabulary, and then we'll move on from there. When you looked at that academic vocabulary in the Common Core, anything stand out on that you want to point out before we move on to the next that you read just now? Anything new, old?
Useful pieces of information.
The last sentence, carefully making professional judgments about which words to devote instructional time to learning. And it's kind of like, know that it's more pressure.
So, Christy, will you repeat that, Christy?
Yes, the carefully make professional judgments about which words to devote instructional time to learning. Thinking about the words that we need to instruct on.
And that's kind of what we're going to be talking about today. That she's exactly right. It is that careful consideration on what words do we really need to really instruct.
What the value is of the word.
What the value of the word.
How valuable, because teachers tend to want to pick hard words.
Right.
But how many times are they going to be exposed to that word? Is it valuable? Is it important for them to understand the content? And if it's not, then.
Which subject areas do you think right now would need more instruction than others in the tiers of words, and which ones are important? All of them, but I think our science and social studies really kind of hang their hat sometimes on those all those tier 3 words, and spend a lot of time trying to teach those, when really they need to be teaching the tier 2 words so they can even understand what the tier 3 words are at some point. So we can go on to the next slide.
Okay.
So it'll review the 3 tiers. We know that tier 1, and this is all defined in the Common Core as well, so those basic and concrete words, those are those words that kids hear. It's their conversational words. The tier 3 words are those highly specialized, domain-specific words. We know those type of words too. They're used to describe content knowledge, and they've given some examples. Okay. Tier 2 are where we need to really be spending our time. It is those precise and more abstract words typically found in written text. For example, saunter, boasted, vehicle. They're referred to as high utility general academic vocabulary because of their frequent appearance across content areas. Rich representation quality, multiple meaning depending on context and connection to other words, seldom defined or scaffolded within text. One of the things that I read that he had said is, and it's true, as teachers, and especially in our science and social studies classrooms, they spend a lot of time on their domain-specific words, but they don't really work on the words that are those tier 2, those connecting words, those words that they're going to have to know in order to move on to the harder words in their vocabulary when they're trying to teach. Okay.
We also want to make sure that when we focus those text-dependent questions on words and phrases, that we are focusing them on the tier 2 words. I want to make sure that it says right here, the contextual analysis of those tier 2 words should be the academic vocabulary focus within close reading exemplar. So you want to use that checklist right here on the second page of that handout that talks about selecting academic vocabulary for close reading instruction, and use those questions as a lens to see for those word and phrase choices to see if you're on the right track.
And I think that checklist, as you're working with teachers, and this might be something you can do with right away, is talk about academic vocabulary with them. And this is a great checklist for teachers to use to see if it really is a tier 2 word that they need to be teaching. Another couple of things on the tier 2 words, trying to think, in the Appendix A, on those pages 32 through 34, there are some exemplars in there that they have examples of what tier 2 words are. So if you want to go back to your frameworks or to your standards sometimes, to the Common Core standards, they have actually, and I didn't know this till last night, but that as you read that, they had given passages of vocabulary and pulled out. So you can go and see what Common Core writers actually also said about tier 2 words and which ones they thought were tier 2 in those exemplars. Yes?
And with PARC, with all the release items that came out the end of August, every single one of them has the EBSR, the Part A, Part B questions, every single release item, and it says specifically they will always have a tier 2 vocabulary question. So it's a 2-part question, so they got to get both of them right. So you can look at all those August ones, and you will see examples of the way PARC is going to assess it. And it's really powerful because the first one, the child says, based on the passage, what do you think basically this word means? But then part B is quotes, always, 4 quotes right out of that article. Which of these quotes makes you think that? So we want to know how we're going to be assessed. Go back to those August release items. It's on every, they tell you, it's going to be at tier 2, every single one.
Our next activity that we want you to do, if you'll look in your handouts, it's on where it says slide 19. It's this voice that challenged the nation. There is a small paragraph there, and at your tables, we want you to spend some time right now picking out what do you think are the tier 2 words that if you were teaching this to a 6th or 7th grade class, as helping your teacher teach this, what are the tier 2 words that you think should be pulled out and would be the tier 2 words that the teacher needs to work with the kids on? So go ahead and you can work with at your tables, with a partner, by yourself, however you want to do it. We'll give you about 3 minutes. Use your checklist. Oh, can I read you something he wrote? I love it. It says, first, reasonable people can disagree on which words qualify as tier 2 words and which ones don't. So I like that. So that means we're all reasonable people here. So we'll talk about that. So there is no, I've had teachers say to me, can you just give me the words you're supposed to know? Can somebody please find the list of words they need to know? We had that the other day, didn't we? We were talking about with our 6th and 7th grade teachers. Just give me the list. There isn't a list. There's a lot of lists, actually. There's not a list that is the perfect words. But it is, as a teacher, you know your kids, and it is professional judgment here. So, what are some of the words that y'all thought? Arrivals.
Earliest arrivals.
Yeah. All right. Earliest arrivals. Okay. What else?
Great. Because it's multiple.
All right. Great, because it's multiple meanings. Okay. Monument. It comes up more than once in text. And did y'all go back and look at your checklist and kind of make sure? He said if you're really struggling and you come up with a word, then go look at your checklist and see, can you say yes to several of those? And if you can, then it's probably a tier 2 word. What else? Okay, I'm going to tell you what he said. I think we talked a lot about mall ourselves. In fact, I think we came up and said it was a tier 2 word. But here's what he says about mall, which I thought was interesting. He says, let me find my right page here. One word that there may be significant disagreement is mall. It will be helpful to explain to participants that this word, in the context of a proper noun, is most appropriately a tier 3 word, given its highly specialized meaning. It would be most effective for students' understanding for teachers to define this particular word of the use mall. I don't know. That's what he said. That in this case, that it's a tier 3 word because it's very. You think about it. The mall what they're talking about is very different than the mall our kids. So it probably would be one that we'd want to talk to our kids about. That they don't necessarily. They can know there's different meanings of the word mall, but it may not be a tier 2 word in this case.
Would that be the same with Washington Monument, that we would teach that as a tier 3 word because it's specialized? Yes.
Well, Washington Monument, but monument itself, I think, would still be a tier 2 word.
But Washington.
Yeah. What other words did y'all come up with?
Spread back.
Do what?
Spread back.
Spread back. What? Stretching?
Stretching and
Extending. Yeah. Reflecting. Yeah.
Extending beyond.
Yeah.
Because that's what I was should have gone together.
Collocation.
So, because extending beyond. I thought that was understanding. Throng, not
I thought throng was probably one of mine as well, as when they were looking at this. It does say that teachers have to develop effective professional judgment in selecting tier 2 words for focus in the Common Core line instruction through extensive and repeated practice. It takes a while. And it really is one of those things that you have to look at and say, look at your checklist and say, and if you come up with a whole lot of words, then you may have to spread it over a couple of times. Let's show them the next one where, this is the ones that he came up with, so you might just kind of look at what his thoughts were. Again, I think it depends on the classroom, your kids. Remember we were thinking about this for 6th and 7th grade.
I didn't do Cradle because I was thinking that if the kids were reading and, folks and sleeping infants in their arms, I didn't think Cradle was necessary really to the meaning. I just thought they would.
True.
So
Yeah.
I didn't do Cradle.
And these were ones that he pulled out specifically, but like he said, all reasonable people can have a disagreement necessarily about it. So these are just examples of things that he had thinking through, and you guys may differ a little bit. And also, the students that you're working with and the grade levels that you're working with also can adjust your view of these words
I think
as
cradle
well.
because maybe the tone of the word as compared to using something else.
Yeah.
And that's probably why, because it has a different tone
Okay.
than just hold them or, whatever. Cradle means a little
So
bit
if you're going for tone of the passage,
You could use
then
cradle
cradled
would be
is something that
That's
you.
Right.
something
You could look at like cradled and propped up and those.
And if you look at the whole text, folks cradled sleeping infants, it goes right back to the beginning about the earliest arrivals found places to
Yeah.
We thought people might not know what folks.
Uh-huh. Folks cradle, yeah. I think that was one of the ones I had. So to wrap up, academic vocabulary, we just wanted you to kind of see that because later on, when we start writing questions, you're going to be looking at passages and what is the academic vocabulary that you think you need to pull out and what are some that you may want to write some text-dependent questions on. Yes?
So we noticed we had chosen all of this and then quite a few more. So in that case, is this where you use your teacher judgment, try to get the biggest bang for your buck on which ones and just kind of gloss over the others or go back at another lesson? What would you
I think both of those would be appropriate. It depends on what you're trying to do with the lesson. Yeah. And I think that might be, we know we could get through a passage like this and go, man, there's 20 words our kids are going to need, but I would probably want to pick, like you said, the most bang for my buck on this. What is it that I think my kids, and since this was supposed to be for 6th or 7th, what is it that they are going to need the most in other passages from this point? So it's going to help them.
And also look at it from what's functional within the passage itself. What's
Right.
going to help them get to that deeper meaning within the passage
Yeah.
itself.
not like?
I mean, it will directly connect to, they'll see those words again in other passages, but I think that if you know your specific purpose in pulling out those words, for instance, like Betsy was saying, when he pulled cradled because that was probably leading to a question about tone, then they, you know what I mean? They pulled those specific words for those specific purposes. It wasn't just to get them to know what the word means. Does that make sense?
Can I restate this, because I think I just heard something a little bit different, and I'm looking at Appendix A. It defines it as general academic words. They're general, so they're really not text, specific. They're general. We're gonna find it across all texts, which is what I think I heard you say, Janet, because they need to know those words, because they will find it
Right.
generally across the bunch of texts. So that is one lens to look at, right?
Which, very good.
Second lens to look at it, which is what you just said, well, maybe you need to look at it from that one, because there are so many general words that you can take either lens, is that correct?
Correct.
Hers is more text.
Right, because it's based on the idea of that specific standard that asks for those students at that level to look for tone or look for words that help show transition or whatever that specific standard might be. You might highlight those words for that purpose.
Either way would be appropriate, correct? Okay, I'm understanding that.
I think that that's a really good point, Sue, but I think that both need to be used together because I know that when I've sat and gone through words with, particularly I've been working with some of my Eli participants, and they picked out, I was looking at a passage that was about a page and a half long, and someone had picked 27 academic words. Well, that's what happens every time when we say pick out academic words, and I understand why people do that. So kind of first, okay, maybe you pick 27, now then what's really specific to this passage? What do we really need to spend our time on?
Right.
So I think that you're right, but I think it's both, not just one.
Which leads me to the next point is that what David Pook would like for us to do is talk at your table. I want you to come up with the biggest aha right now about vocabulary, that if you were going to try to summarize this for someone in 1 or 2 sentences, what would that be? And we want you to post it on today's meet. So we're going to give you about 5 minutes to talk about it, write it, and post it on today's meet. You might just put academic vocabulary to us is, or whatever you want to do on there so that he knows that we have finished this section. But it is kind of that final word. What is it that you got from this?
post these as a table, that's absolutely fine.
Done? Okay. Would anybody share their, I know it's on today's meeting, but I can't read them because I can't see that far. What were some of the things that y'all said as your ahas for academic vocabulary?
Somebody said intended student audience changes the possibilities for the tier 2 words. So like your L's or your pre-AP or whatever, which going from that particular lens. Tier 2 words, these are the words we think kids know but they don't. I like.
Yeah.
Light bulb, the focus should be on tier 2 words since they are cross-curricular. Students need more specific instruction with tier 2.
Okay, good thoughts. Well, I think we talked back here at another table that a lot of tier 2 words aren't very concrete. There are a lot of abstract ideas, and that's another reason why sometimes they're a little bit harder to teach to our kids, especially our L's. Okay.
And there are also different parts of speech, which we had a discussion about over at the middle school table. So that could be a natural extension when you go to talk about speech.
Okay, so I think we're going to move on to our next, so we're going to wrap up academic vocabulary. We're still going to use what we learned from that for the next parts, but it's kind of, we're going to shift on to another.
This is actually a good activity that we're going to take you through the process of. So this is something when I first went through it, I was kind of like, okay, just kind of, I went through the motions and then didn't really get it until after I was done. So if you kind of feel like you're just going through the motions, you will get it after we're finished with this. So what he specifically was saying that each grade level has specific end-of-year expectations in reading, writing, speaking, and listening and language, and we know these are specific in their frameworks, or in their standards, excuse me. And across grades, there is a cumulative progression of understandings and skills. That's what we were talking about with that stair step throughout the grade level progressions. And each standard has a one-to-one correspondence within its anchor standard. So you could look at whatever anchor standard 2 is and see that direct correlation in how it looks in kindergarten all the way up through 12th grade. And know specifically what that grade level is asking for that anchor standard.
And you guys know that we have the progressions, thankfully, to our ESL department on the W Drive, which I will, for every single standard. So you can pull that up and look at the standard, and you can look at it from K to 12 and what it looks like differently in each one. And I will send that out in a few minutes or at lunch so that you know how to find that progression of the standards, as well as he gave us a resource I told you there's no list of tier 2 words, but here's a resource that might help you with some tier 2 words, and I'll send that link out as well at lunch. So
what he wants us to do with this is he wants you to pay specific attention to standards 5 and 8, and if you look in your handouts, we are referring to I believe it's 6th grade, is that right, Jamie? 6th grade. So you're going to look at the 6th through 8th grade students on that standards spectrum there. We want you to look specifically at standards 5 and 8. And after you familiarize yourself with standards 5 and 8, we want you to read that particular piece of text that's on the next page, that little paragraph about the letter from Birmingham jail. And we want you to come up with a text-dependent question that aligns to those standards. So look for what that standard is asking, and then try to develop a question in that text that is asking the students to think about that standard. Does that make sense? Okay. This is going to take a while.
And you can work with a partner.
Yes, work with a partner.
6-8.
Okay, nobody's yelling, so I think you don't need time anymore. Okay. Okay, who would like to share their text-dependent questions? Don't be shy. There's no wrong answers today. Do what, Marie? I heard you had a good one.
She's advanced, I'm just.
Okay.
Lana has volunteered. Marie, you want to share?
What keywords identify the text structure?
Okay.
What keywords identify the text structure?
Okay. Good.
Follow
What-
that with another question, what is the text structure?
What is the text structure?
And we did it backwards. We said the first one, what is the text structure? How did the author structure this? And your part B question was, what words did the author use to justify your answer to part A?
If you don't mind, could you post those on the today's meet so that we can share them today? Post them on the today's meet so that we can share them today.
Okay, who else has one? Lisa? Okay, guys, let's listen, please.
We were thinking about what was the significance of the progression of how he documented his thoughts, from scribbles to little scraps of paper to now he's documenting it, and what is the significance, but is that?
Well, I think that we
You
will.
have to infer.
Yeah, yeah, infer a lot.
You do have to say the progression like you just did though. You wanna ask them that, what is the progression?
What is the progression?
And then you can infer the significance of that. It's okay to infer.
And then what is the progression of how
the documentation.
And how is that significant? I think we're afraid, Chris and I were talking, I think we're so afraid to go to inferencing, we don't need to be afraid to make an inference. Because studying the text should lead to logical inferences. And I may be completely wrong on that, but I think that we don't just study the progression. Now, why did it happen that way?
And that's where I took it, because I kind of went.
That was my first thought.
The inferencing is, what would be the significance of those words like begun, continued, concluded, and eventually, because it's almost emphasizing the fact that he's trying to emphasize his treatment of there. So I took it like beyond, like more of an inferencing and what those words or phrases told you, and what, that's.
And using those keywords.
Right, the keywords from there.
But you couldn't answer that without.
No, you still have to talk about.
So that's the deal. You couldn't talk about significance without the text first. And so that's, to me, what makes it still text dependent.
And without using those keywords that are
Would somebody over there, what is the significance of, would you finish that?
Sure, go ahead. Could you repeat the question one more time, Lisa?
The one I started with was, what is the significance of the progression of how he documented his thoughts? So first I would have to get them to know what is the progression.
What is the progression, and then go to the significance.
Especially because standard 5 is structure based first, not inference based.
I think that one of the things that he wanted us to do is look at, and this is one of the ways you can ask questions on this with using the standards. And you have to really look at those standards and take them pretty literally, because that one was about sequence and maybe and how a passage, the text structure. And then I pulled up the next slide. When you first look at this, and the first time I read it, I didn't get it. Even when I read the standard, I didn't get what he was talking about. So I think this kind of teaches us to really look at passage and see what is significant about this sentence or these couple of sentences that I could write a text-dependent question. So when he did this for us and showed us that if you look, it does, and all of y'all picked up on, he has those, so a text-dependent question could be, what words does the author use or to propel you through the sequence of this story, which would be begun, continued, concluded, eventually. But having kids even look at that as a sequence event, and that they have to pull out those sequence words would be one of the reasons that he pulled this to our attention, in showing us a way that we can look at the standards, which we'll practice on this, to write text-dependent questions.
And I remember he did say, in that particular standard, it just talks about the structure of the text, but then in parentheses it has the example, sequential or causal, or that type of thing. So it helps if you are familiar with not just what it says in the standard, but also those examples that are given as well, because if you do see that type of pattern, bringing a question out for the students to be able to identify that pattern as well is going to help them with their understanding of the text. Marcia, you want to share something?
Yeah, our question was, is there evidence of MLK's progression in writing the letter? So first they would have to decide whether or not there is evidence and then what it was.
Could you guys, if you have a question at your tables, if you would please put it on the today's meet for your group, because David will be looking at this throughout the day, so this will be helpful for him to get an idea as to where we are as a group.
And then here's another one where if you looked at just even the progression of the paper that we wrote, you can make your questions. I mean, sometimes we have to really look at our question and make sure that it's one that kids can answer. So here, if you look at it, and this is when I finally figured this thing out, and it says, oh, first he wrote in the margins of a newspaper. What was the progression, or what type of, how did Martin Luther King first write this letter? On what kind of paper did he write this letter? How did he get his thoughts down on paper? Well, he first wrote it in margins, then he had scraps, and then finally he ended up with a tag from his attorney. But it shows just a progression even in that one sentence. So I think it just brings us to showing that we really can look at text in lots of different ways, and the standards help us figure out what, how to look at that.
So what question would you have that went with margins, scraps, and pads? What was your question there?
I think our question was if kids understood the word progression, but how did Martin Luther King, something about how did he get his letter written? Or what was the progression of materials he used to write his letter?
Yeah.
Something like that. Y'all may have a better one.
No, that is what we've said this
Okay.
summer. But he also, I think you went to the next one. He did keep pointing out, anytime somebody asked questions like, and this came up over here too, which resources did he use? It wasn't enough because that wasn't the structure. They could have easily said pads, scraps, margins, and really it's important that they get that it started with something he had to gather himself, something that somebody else gave him, something that somebody official gave him. He pointed that out that
And the text
if you
structure is
don't get it at
beginning,
the
middle, and end, and how he started at the beginning, and how he progressed in the middle, and it also leads to the importance of it as well.
Right. But just asking which resources isn't enough. It had to be the text structure. And I think everybody's done that.
And if you look at this one, you can even say, how did he get his resources and in what order? Because here, he had to find himself in jail, and then he had a Negro trustee that gave him his resources, and then he finally had his attorney. So there is a progression through that, even through that paragraph. So there's several things that you can look at that one little sentence and find lots of questions that you could ask kids that they'd have to go back and look at the text for.
And I don't know how to frame the question, but the one word that stands out to me that's in direct contrast with every other word in the sentence is the word friendly.
Yeah.
And friendly is the one word in that sentence that points out, it's the only word that shows an opinion.
Right.
And so I'm not sure how to frame that question, but I think that kind of goes back to that standard 8 also.
Yeah. And it is hard to write the questions sometimes.
I don't know what the question is,
Yeah.
but I know what they
Ask David who. How do
I think it's okay to pull in word choice there.
Right.
And talk about which words does he use that signify an opinion versus.
The word eventually is important.
Right.
Yeah.
The word eventually is very important.
That's a great
Yeah.
question. Yeah.
His opinion of a person.
Okay, which leads us to our next activity after lunch, which we'll be talking about To Kill a Mockingbird, just a passage from there. And it is 11:30, and so we're going to let everybody go to lunch, and we'll see you back here at 12:45.
Ready to go.
Because what I did was I was looking at this show.
Go through that from that standard, get your idea of what that standard was asking, and then develop a specific question to align to that specific standard. That's just one of the methods that David Pook has showed us we can use to help us develop our text-dependent questions. What we're going to do now is we're going to do a little bit different approach to this. And the one thing that I want to tell you is what he told us, and this makes absolute sense. He said everybody has a different method, a different way of coming up with their text-dependent questions, and it just depends on who you are as a reader, who you are as a learner, and who you are as a processor. However, he's showing us in our examples this afternoon, we're going to take you through several different ways to produce these text-dependent questions. There's no one right way to do it. So whichever one of these particular ways feels most comfortable for you, go with that. If you want to try out, we want you to try all of them. We want you to go through all of them, process through all of them. But honestly, I have a favorite. I know Janet has a favorite. I know Tammy Butler has a favorite. She shared it with me. So you do. You have a favorite process with this.
I do.
And so we really just want to take you through all these different methods so that you can get that practice and feel where your comfort really lies in developing these questions. Okay? So with that in mind, we're going to shift. And you have in your handout packet an excerpt from To Kill a Mockingbird, personally one of my favorite stories. What we're going to do is we're actually going to do the reverse of what we did with the Dr. Martin Luther King letter. With the Dr. Martin Luther King letter, we had you look at a standard, pull apart the wording of the standard, develop a question in alignment with that standard. With this particular text, we want you to make sure that you are reading the whole text, coming up with what you think would be a good text-dependent question for that particular piece of text, without any idea as to the standard at all. You're just coming up with what you think would be a good text-dependent question for that particular piece of text. Then we're going to take you through a worksheet to see how it aligns to the different standards. Okay, so it's a little bit different. So we want you to go ahead and take the time to read through that excerpt, come up with a text-dependent question. Any level. It could be word phrase level, it could be sentence level, it could be paragraph level, it could be the whole thing. But come up with a text-dependent question for that particular text. We are going to take you through your next handout in your packet. Your next handout in your packet is called the Text-Dependent Question Worksheet. And hopefully it is the next slide.
Oh, go a little quicker.
All right. This is a systematic approach to testing your text-dependent questions. And you're also aligning them to the demands of Common Core. Okay? So if you look at this particular sheet, we are looking down here, okay? Because we've already come up with a question. So we're going to focus down here where it says question checklist. You come up with your question, and now you're going to go through steps 1, 2, and 3 to see, it's like a way to kind of sift through the layers of your standards to see where that question really qualifies and how it truly aligns to the standard. So for instance, the first question, is there a particular word or phrase that's the focus?
Hey, Carrie, back up. I want to look right here, though. I like this line right here because I know as I was talking to a few of you, you're even wondering, is this a text-dependent question? So this right here says, I stand here to read it, use professional judgment in assessing whether or not the question is text-dependent using the following checklists. If no boxes are checked for this particular step, revise the question appropriately. So that is kind of right there. That's kind of like Carrie said, but that's the whole point of that checklist is you're trying to decide, is this really text-dependent or not? Because we can come up with great questions, but does it make the kids go back to the text Yes.
Well, can I ask, when it's
Uh-huh.
asking those, like, is there a word or a phrase or a sentence, does that mean you're asking the student to find those, or that's in your question?
That's in your question.
Oh, so it has to be,
If it's within the word of your question,
So, like, if I- okay.
yeah, if the
So if
focus
the
of
word
that question is to look at a word or a phrase, then
Okay.
you would check that. If
and
the-
it's not their response to it, it's their.
Correct.
It's your question,
Your
yeah.
question.
So does it have to hit all three or just one?
You wanna go through all three steps. But after you're done seeing whatever you check, that will tell you what standards your question is telling you you're focusing on. Okay. So go ahead and take your questions and take them through that worksheet. And you can talk to your neighbors.
Yeah, I know.
Guys, I think that you're probably having some great discussion at your table, but I would love to hear some of that discussion for the group, because I think at this point, we can sit here and really think about our questions and how this worksheet, who would, share, and, this is that time when you have to not worry about if your question is great or not, because, we would, even when we did with David Pook, we thought we had a great question, and we ended up finding out that it could have been greater. So, who would share a question with us and let us just kind of talk about it with this worksheet? Thank you.
So just any questions?
Any of your
Melanie?
questions?
Yeah.
Melanie?
Okay, so we have, in the last paragraph, what did the author mean when she said a 24-hour day seemed longer?
And then when you took it through the worksheet, did you see a specific standard that it aligned to?
Well,
Or standards?
in step 1, it was standard 5. Is there a particular paragraph that is the focus? Step 2, we decided it was, there were standard 2, 4, and 8. Okay. And then step 3, what do you call it? Standard
So, read your question again.
In the last paragraph, what did the author mean when she said a 24-hour day seems longer?
Now, the only thing I would think, and I'm just thinking about this question, because I think as a student, it almost seems like it's my opinion, but maybe if you said what words did the author use, then they would have to go back and look at what are the words that the author used. I don't know.
But if we're going with the assumption that they have to use textual evidence to support
Right.
their answer, do we need to say that specifically?
I don't know, but see, I think I would pose that question to him, and I would love for you to write that question and say, or does it need to be this, that specific? Because that's a question I have, because when I hear that question, I would kind of go, I wonder what the author means. I guess it means that days seem longer than 24 hours because they don't have anything to do, rather than me going back
What if
and
you say
finding.
cite evidence from the story to,
Yeah.
Use
Yeah.
textual evidence
Support
to,
your-
okay, in the last paragraph, you would say something like, use textual evidence to explain why in the last paragraph, the author said.
I think that would be, yeah.
Okay.
Or you
Yeah.
could even say, how does the author share the idea that the day seemed 20, longer? That way, they're having to look back at the text to see how the authors pulled that information from. Does that make sense?
But what if you wanted to, like,
I would ask him that question on today's meet, because I really think that's an important question for us to ask. Do we have to be that explicit when we're asking a question, or can we assume that kids know that if you go back and look at the text, since that's what we're doing? I don't know the answer to that. I think we need to ask him.
And I feel really, like I am trying to justify the standards instead of just being able to go, you know what I'm saying? I'm trying to justify that my question met those standards.
Right, and that's actually what you're doing. You're
But
trying to.
it's like, maybe they didn't, but I'm just trying to make it fit. That's the way I feel right now.
So
I'm
if
just
there,
trying
if
to make
there's,
it fit.
right, so if there's not necessarily a natural connection to what's going on, then that might be an indication that you need to look at the way that it's crafted or something like that, along those lines. Now, if you're wondering specifically, the use of this worksheet, like we said before, this is one of several tools. And so when we introduce those other tools, you may find that those are a little bit more to your, way of thinking about it. But the idea is, a lot of times we come up with text-dependent questions and we're thinking that they're really great, but they're not necessarily aligned to the standard that we wanted them to be aligned to, or they're not aligned to a standard that's at a deep enough level. For instance, he said most of the time, teachers naturally will pick standards 2, 3, and 4 for their questions, but really, using this worksheet, you can kind of see your pattern over time as to what standards you're hitting, so that you can be aware of which questions to craft in the future to make sure you're hitting all of the standards to the depth it needs to be.
And I think going back to Melanie's question a second ago, when I was writing questions and he was looking at them, and especially the second day when they really looked at all of our questions, what I found really interesting, and I think y'all will find interesting, is that it's almost like he simplifies our questions a little bit in that they are, you have to really kind of when somebody else looks at your question, you know what you mean when you write a question. You know what, in the end, you want the kids how to answer it. But when an outsider looks at your question, they would look at it and go, I wonder what they really meant here. So he really made the questions, I think, more explicit so that it wasn't that hard for the students to really understand what you were asking, because it was, does that make sense, Carrie? Is that kind of what you got that day and whoever else was here? It seemed like sometimes he would say, I think the point you're trying to make here, and here's how I'd phrase this question. So.
But what if we want, I feel like with those questions that we're supposed to look at, one through, like, does it look at a phrase, focus on a phrase, that we are gonna be providing textual evidence where I would want the kids to show me evidence of something. Do you know what I'm saying? Like, I want them to tell me what the weather was like, or whatever. How do we know that it was hot and humid or whatever? Well, they're gonna pick out sweltering and sagged and wilted but the way that is, I would have to say, what do the words sweltering and wilted tell me about the weather of Macomb or something.
And wouldn't you say either one of those, depending on what you want the kids to gain from it, either one of those would be.
Okay, so, but.
You can go about it either way.
Okay, well, cause when I asked earlier, I was thinking the way it was answered was that I would provide the word or phrase instead of the student providing the word or phrase.
Either way, sometimes you provide it for them because you want to analyze. You want to make them analyze what the author said.
Right.
Other times you're wanting them to answer your question and go back and find where that evidence would be. So I think both ways you're making them go to the text.
So it can work that way, because I wanted to make sure, because I felt like I'd be providing the evidence all the time.
Here's how we phrased our question. The first one is, how does the author describe Macomb? Is that how you pronounce it? Macomb. And then, what specific vocabulary does the author use to create the visual image of the town?
So those are like a layered question?
Yes. And so we're not giving them the answer of the vocabulary to use, but we're giving them the direction we want them to go.
And I think that brings another good point up, is that as a teacher, this is the first page of that book, and I remember when I read this the first time, in that very first line, when it talks about that he broke his arm, I remember thinking, and I read the entire book, I couldn't wait to find out when he broke his arm. And if you've read the book, it takes a long time to find out. I was really frustrated with that. But I think that as you're reading that first page, and as a teacher in the 9th grade classroom who's going to teach this here in a couple of weeks or now, they in their mind know why they chose this. And it's probably to give setting to this story and for foreshadowing. Am I right? So what else would it be, Kelly? Because I know you love this book. And
to establish tone.
To establish tone. So your questions, and we didn't talk about this, but I would assume that if you knew as a teacher those are the things that you were going to really want, that's why you chose this, then all of your questions, or a lot of them, would be around those 3 things. So I think that would help with your lens a lot when you're trying to text business questions, is when you choose a passage, why did you choose it first? What was the purpose, and what do you want the kids to get out of it? Not just, right now we're writing questions just to write questions, and can we do text dependent? But when we're doing this for real, and you're doing it for teachers, you're going to have a specific purpose, and I think it's going to be a little easier to write questions because you're going to know what you want the kids to gain from that passage. So
looking at a part for this one right now, and I'm pulling from this, and my question would be, how are the, I'm reading part, how are the events and paragraph 4 and 5, import it to the tone of this story. It's just a paraphrase of a release
Right.
from August.
Yeah.
It's exactly what you said. Read that question again. I took the part when I just changed 2 words. How are the events in paragraph 4 and 5 important to the tone of the story? And then it's an A, B, C, D.
Would descriptions be a better word than events?
Descriptions,
I don't
maybe.
know.
Word choices.
Word choices, yeah.
Because it's specific words that help us.
Good.
And somebody needs to put that on there for today's meet so that,
That's even better.
David Pook knows that we wrote that question and he'll think it's good, so he'll,
That was great, because he probably wrote that originally.
Yeah.
Hey, Sue, since you're looking at park assessment questions, do they ever pull out the sentence like this and say, they ambled
Yes,
across
yes.
the square, shuffled in and out of the stores around it, took their time about everything. What does that say about the people in this passage or whatever?
Because I read you the part A, and it's just a simple one. It could be like, the words show the slow pace of the town.
Okay,
But then there's a part B.
Okay.
Gotta know the part B. Which sentence from the story, which of the following describes the best support for your answer in part
Okay,
A?
and that's
You
where
have to
they
have that part B.
Yeah. So that clarifies our answers to, her question, yes, about which direction do I go? We're gonna need to do both. And I didn't realize that till today, so.
Are there any additional questions about this worksheet? This is, like I said before, just one of the many tools we're gonna do with next afternoon. Okay. The next way of going about developing text-dependent questions is to, of course, look at the piece of text. And if I could have somebody read this poem. Anyone read this poem?
I was thinking I volunteered somebody last time, and she wasn't happy.
There's no wrong with it. Anyway, can read.
I think Lena would be a very
I'll read it.
We're supposed to do wait time, Carrie, remember?
I know.
I'll read it.
All right, Chrissy said she read it. Thank you, Chrissy.
I always like summer best. You can eat fresh corn from Daddy's garden, and okra, and greens, and cabbage, and lots of barbecue, and buttermilk, and homemade ice cream at the church picnic, and listen to gospel music outside at the church homecoming, and you go to the mountains with your grandmother, and go barefooted, and be warm all the time, not only when you go to bed and sleep.
Good reading.
Thank you.
It makes me cry.
I can do that. I can't do these text questions, but I can.
All right, so the next page of this is an example. It's called Pulling It All Together, Text-Dependent Questions for Instruction. And it actually is a sheet that's set up where the text is in the middle. And there are 9 different question types that show the possibilities of the text-dependent questions that can be used for an informative piece, a piece of poetry, literary work, whatever. And these are ways to kind of frame your questions to help you uncover that meaning to that depth. And so if you look, it asks, write their questions, ask for explicit information, organizing questions, examining the text and sorting information based on relevant criteria. And you can see the way these are set up, they do hit the standards. They're just framed a little bit differently.
And then if you go to the next sheet, oh no, never mind. We'll tell you that in a minute. But go ahead and read this a little bit, because I think, and if you look at that poem, which is right in the middle, and you can read through the questions, you'll see. So now we've given you, there's basically about 3 different ways so far that you can use, have things to write text-dependent questions. So we've got the worksheet, we had the just picking the standard, the other worksheet, and now one, and we'll give you a template for this in a minute. But read this.
And look at the different levels of questioning that is already put on this paper for you as an example. saw I had examples right there. So that really helped me kind of hinge my thinking on how to process through these particular right there questions versus text structure questions. I liked having that there as an example. Is there any big ahas that you guys have gotten from looking at this in comparison to what the other two worksheets that we look, or the other two methods that we talked about?
This just goes over different types of questions that you can ask and gives specific examples of how those questions would be set up. And I like that.
It kind of connects to our understanding of the types of higher order thinking questions that we're used to facilitating in discussions with students. So to me, that kind of made a connection. Anything else?
It also lends itself to helping us establish what was our purpose for teaching this passage. Was it, do we want to work on inferring? Do we want to work on sequencing? It breaks things up for us in a logical way for me.
Well, and it makes you ask different types of questions. You won't have the same type of question.
Right. Well, good news is you get to practice. So turn your page, and you've got Winston Churchill's Blood, Toil, Sweat, Tears and Sweat. There is a passage. And then behind that is the text-dependent question types worksheet. And we want you to practice, give you a little bit of time to read this and then write your own text-dependent questions on this worksheet.
And we want you to work together as groups.
Yeah. So we'll give you a few minutes to do that, so you have time to use this resource.
Most of you, if you're anything like me, only had 2 questions written down exactly. Couple of things. You've gotten a chance to process through this. You've gotten a chance to look. And at your tables, we'd like for you to share what you think some of your best examples are and put them on the today's meet for David to look at. Okay? This helps him to know our thinking. He has worked with so many groups of teachers across the country. He can pinpoint, based on the work we're giving him, he can pinpoint the next steps to help us in that process. That's why we really want to share these ideas with him. And Marcia Hamilton and Tammy and Kristen, when we were there working with him, based on the questions we were sharing with him, he was able to take us to that next level of understanding. So sharing those questions with him is going to help us get to a deeper level of understanding. So please take the time at your tables, next 2 or 3 minutes, go ahead and just figure out 1 or 2 questions that you would like to share on the today's meet. And after you type the question, type what type of question it was. So if it was a right there question, put that there. Okay? Thank you for typing those up on the today's meet. David will get a chance to look through them, and that will help us with our conversation with him this afternoon. If you could go ahead and flip through to the next page after your open template, you will see that he's given you some examples for that particular piece of text. We're not going to tell you what we need
Some people found it already.
So this will give you an idea as to where he was thinking these questions.
I know, they have to look at them, yeah.
Okay, we could spend a lot of time comparing our thinking to his thinking on this, but we're gonna move on. Sorry. I know, but this is the best part right here. So after we've taken you through, had you come up with questions based on text, take standards and write questions aligned to those, write random ones and align them to the standards, and then also come up with all the different types of questions and produce those from your text. The next thing he does is he takes us back to the standards again, and he explains to us that these standards, because they're written in such a way, they lead themselves to question stems. So if you want to go ahead and flip ahead, he has CCSS aligned question stems in a handout. What this is these are question stems that have been designed around each standard. They are jumping off point for you to use. What he did with us, because honestly, when I got this, I was like, seriously, I did all this thinking, it was right here. But what he really wants us to understand is that these are question stems. These are a way for you to generate and frame your questions. However, they are not to be used directly, plug and play. Okay? That's not the intention. The intention is for you to be thinking along the same lines as these questions, make them work for the particular text that you've selected. And he even told us one of our activities was to take one of the questions we had written, look at the stems, and then try to rewrite the question within the stem. And that was tricky.
Yeah, it was really.
It really did not feel comfortable. I don't know about you guys, but it did not feel comfortable for me. And I think it was because we had the practice of coming up with and composing those questions throughout and doing all that deep thinking, that by the time we finally got these stems, we were like, well, these are okay, but really I like what I've been thinking about so far. This is just a way for you to use to see if your thinking is on the right track, okay?
And he said changing words within the stems was really important. Oftentimes, like earlier, somebody had read a question and we changed it. Sue read that question. We changed it from events to descriptions, that kind of thing.
Right.
So I think there's freedom in the stems.
Yes, there's very much freedom in the stems. The other thing he said, and this was a word of caution, is that he said, please do not take these aligned question stems back to teachers and say, here you go, now you got your answer. That will not bring you to the level that you really need to be with both your understanding and the teacher's understanding, and really, inevitably, the student's understanding, because these are good places for you to align your thinking, but they are not, like he said, the be-all and end-all of questioning for these standards, okay? With that in mind, we are going to do a shift and connect all of these practices that we've had with text-dependent questions and align them a little bit more to our assessment that we know is coming in the future. When we assess complex text, and this is why we really appreciate David's connection with us, he's worked on the PARC assessments, he's a reviewer of the PARC assessments, and so he's given those developers a lot of feedback on it, which is great for us because then we can kind of get on the same wavelength of thinking that the PARC assessment people are on. So in your packet, you have a handout talking about evidence and the Common Core State Standards, and how extracting evidence is the primary activity that really flows throughout all of your anchor reading standards. And evidence is prioritized for both writing arguments and informative explanatory text. So citing evidence is explicitly cited as a bridge between the reading and writing standards of the Common Core. So they can cite the evidence in the text That's going to lend them more information when they go to explain it through a writing process. And that's really a way that they're going to check it on the PARC assessment. They're going to be looking for, can they pull that explicit evidence out of the text and then create that writing to align itself to show that evidence, to show that thinking, to answer that question, whatever that question might be. Okay? He gave us a couple of samples of things that may occur from his understanding of the PARC assessment. For instance, a sample narrative performance task says, in the passage, the author used key details and rich vocabulary to develop a strong character named, is it Maya? Is that his name?
I think this is a 7th grade, isn't it? Sixth grade example.
Think about Mayax and the words and details the author used to create that character. Write an original story to continue where the passage ended. In your story, be sure to use what you have learned about the character Mayax from your close reading of the passage as you tell what happens to her next. So those students are going to have to continue that story, but they're first going to have to analyze the text that's given to them first. Figure out those character traits. Figure out all of the different information that shows evidence in that first piece that was originally written from Julia the Wolf, and then extend their narrative from there. That's a big difference from where we are with them.
And I know some of our UBD units that we've been writing, I know this is exactly what we've done with our narrative piece. We've had them do something, they may not have taken it after a story, but we've used, I know in 7th grade they learned about Middle Ages, and so they had to write a narrative based on all the information they learned and set it during that setting, and I think we've done some others. So we are incorporating this into our UBD units right now.
Trying to figure it out from the elementary school.
Yeah.
Still trying to get there. For the sample argumentative performance task, here's an example right here. You've read 3 texts describing Amelia Earhart. The 3 texts are, all 3 include the claim that Earhart was a brave, courageous person. Consider the argument each author uses to demonstrate Earhart's bravery. Then write an essay that analyzes the strength of the arguments about Earhart's bravery in at least 2 of the texts. Remember to use textual evidence to support your ideas. So they have to read all the pieces of text, closely read them, identify the claim and how they show evidence of that claim. And then they have to compose an argumentative essay that analyzes the strengths of the arguments in each of those pieces of text.
I'm sure. Y'all seen this one before? Yeah.
Where are exemplars of text with these kinds, with these structures in it? So I really would love to see some exemplars.
Well, the text exemplars that are in Appendix B of the Common Core State Standards, they have those in there.
But the question that you're asking, to be honest, there aren't any.
There aren't any. And
I
there's
mean,
no specific
yeah.
list
Yes,
anywhere.
there will be.
Yeah, I'm sure there will be.
And I'm sure there's a lot of companies out there that say that these are Common Core. And I mean, if you're looking at, are you asking where are the questions like this or the answers? Examples, okay. I will say, I don't know if anybody got it, and I have to be honest, I have not had time to really look at it. It was 600 pages, so, but if anyone, it was called In Common. And it was something I got through an email not long ago. I will look at that and send a link to. Another link, I better write that down. I didn't do the first 2, but I'll do it. Anyway, it said, I did download it, and what it was taken from, and it was, I think I got it from Achieve the Core, so it was a good source.
I have it on my computer right now,
And you read through 3.
And I haven't analyzed it in depth, but from my, it doesn't connect with this.
It doesn't? Okay, I haven't looked at it. It did have passages and it had sample answers.
And it shows you from kindergarten, if you have
Right.
an argumentative essay, kindergarten all the way through 12th grade, what
Right.
it would look like. But, and again, I haven't really
I
done.
haven't either.
I haven't looked at it in depth, but.
I'll send y'all that link as well in a few minutes. And y'all can maybe get on and look, but I mean, it's something to look at. I don't know if it's valid or good or what, but it might be a place to look, so.
Then a sample explanatory performance task. So read the sentence from the passage on space diamonds. And then explain how information learned from the space diamonds can help scientists make diamonds on Earth, and use evidence from the passage to support your answer. The park assessment, we know they're going to have the performance-based assessment component that's going to be administered 75%, after 75% of the year has been taught, which is our normal testing window that we're used to, the end of March, beginning of April. They also are looking at an end-of-the-year assessment that will be administered after approximately 90% of the school year has been taught, so that will be again in May. That's what we're looking at right now. The park assessment system, we have end of the year at each grade level that will include 4 to 5 texts, both literary and informational. It includes science, social studies, historical, and technical texts for grades 6 through 11. And then a number of short answer comprehension and vocabulary questions will be associated with each of these texts. The performance-based assessments at each grade level will include the 3 different tasks of narrative, research simulation, and literary analysis. And for each task, the students will be asked to read 1 or more texts, answer several short comprehension and vocabulary questions, and also write an essay that requires them to draw evidence from the text that they've read.
Carrie, I have a question on that one. This part released the document, write an essay. Essay is 2 columns for elementary of what the product may look like. Essay being one of literally about 20, 25.
Yes.
On the back page, it adds what 6 through 8 would add, and then it adds what 9 and up would add.
Right.
So, am I right?
I mean, right now, it's, this is
I questioned when I saw write an essay.
Right, this is as the information's been presented to us through David. Okay, so this is his presentation, that they're going to be able to write an essay. Now, what his idea of an essay may be different than what our idea of an essay may be. Because our background information may be 5-paragraph essay, boom, boom, boom. He may just be thinking it's an informative piece of writing, and it can be in any context and in any format. Okay, we're not exactly sure, but we can ask him, and we can put that up there. Okay, so in your packet, we have a next generation test. And this next generation test is actually one that we want you to take. We want you to look at it, and it includes reading this piece of text. And then there are several questions on the next 2 pages. We want you to try it. Now, I will tell you, when Janet and I took this test afterwards, we were like, holy cow, I do not know what's going on. But, just so that I think, because we don't get a chance, I mean, we know when benchmark comes out, we're not allowed to even look at the test. So, it's a good idea, to me, to be able to take that test as a student would take that test to kind of get an idea of the types of questions that are going to be going on here. So, if you want to go ahead, we're going to give you about 15 minutes to take this test. And then we'll talk about it after.
Well, and then it'll be about time to call David Pook. So any questions that you have, we might want to, as you're looking at this test or anything else, you may want to go to today's meet and put those on there, because we will get a hold of him again about 2:15 and have a wrap-up time with him. And then anything else that in here we didn't get through, we'll finish a little bit after, at the very end today. But please bring back this information on next Friday, because we'll be using it again. So, what grade level is this?
I believe it was, let me double check.
First, yeah.
2nd grade?
I think it was about 8th grade.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I think it was 8th grade.
Yeah. I think so. Uh-huh. What did you remember what he said?
He said 8th and 9th.
8th and 9th grade, is that what he said?
And I know that those are 2 different bands, but yeah.
Yeah. Basically the explanations for the answers, so maybe that would give you better, some thoughts on how that this was, answered. But this is something similar to what, and this was, David Pook wrote this. It is his own sample of a park assessment to give people an idea, so that this is not like a, a park one that is out, but it is a sample one. So, question, and I know one of the things he told us, and those that were there, if they can help remember, but, one of the things he told us is that on this, let's say that they got answer A, they got number 1 right, but they didn't get number 2 right to back up their answer. He told us that you would not get points for the first one. So it is, you know, it's one of those things, so it really eliminates the guessing. So this is why we're gonna really work with our students to, be able to back up their evidence and really understand what they're reading. Anything else? I don't know what else to say about, I didn't do very well on this one, so. I did get pulled out of the room, I didn't read the whole thing, but.
I think too that
She was
one of
pulled out for
the,
intervention.
Yeah. That's true.
one of the other things he said about that was that that there would be distractors, because a lot of kids might be able to match part A to part B and recognize, oh, there are some answers that match, so it's got to be that one. But they would make sure that there were that part B matched different things than part A, so they could.
And I don't know if you guys heard what Kristen just said, but she was talking, and I know you guys are all second here.
Yeah.
But Kristen was talking about the idea that the park assessments were specifically built so that those kids that think that they're good at test taking can be taken off course by the distractors that are put out there. For instance, if they know, I don't really need to read the question, I can look at this answer and see if it connects to this answer and try to make that and just make that their answer, it could be completely wrong. And they do that on purpose. They want them to be able to look at the text, analyze the text, and really understand, go back and find that evidence to back it up.
We've got about 5 minutes left, and we want to kind of wrap up before we talk to David Pook again. Any questions today before we, and we'll talk again at the very end, but we won't keep you much past David Pook. The rest of today's information that's in this packet, again, just bring back the PowerPoint and this, because we'll just continue on Friday next week. Carrie and I will be sending out an email probably later today or first thing Monday morning, and kind of tell you which, what text we would like for you to bring and what grade level for next time. So we'll get that to you, but that's all you need to bring next time are your PowerPoint, your handouts, and some text of whatever grade level we ask you to bring. And is there anything else?
Nope. Elementary, I have a piece of paper here to hand to you that actually has your groups, and we just want you to find a piece of exemplar text for whatever grade level you're assigned to for Unit 3. I'm looking at Unit 3. Alright. We're going to try to connect with David. He hopefully will be able to look at our questions. If you have any other additional questions for him, make sure you have them readily available. Don't be shy. Please share, because he really does want to hear our thinking on this.
And we've got him for 45 minutes, so really ask any questions that you want, because we want to maybe, this will be a great time for all those things that you thought of today that we can get answers on. Let's see. Are we ready?
I think so.
Do we need to switch this over? You know how to do that?
Yes.
Sure.
Here, go ahead, video.
Yeah, he's on, so we can.
If not, I know the other buttons.
Okay, here we go.
Oh, I got something else.
Okay.
Just hit no next.
I thought his little thing was green.
Well, it did this earlier.
Okay.
He might be out of the room.
Just something about lunch that makes me, the rest of the day makes me tired. Maybe we should have brunch. That look like him? Hey, David.
Hi.
How are you?
I'm good. How are you guys?
I think we're tired.
Yeah, I was gonna say, thoroughly exhausted would be the right answer. Based on, all the questions that I saw on the, today's meet. You guys have been working hard.
I think they're really quiet right now, David. They've been processing too much.
Well, they just.
That's okay. You know, the truth is, this is hard work. If it were easy, you know, we would have given the silver bullet away a long time ago. It's just really challenging work. It's good work, it's rewarding work, and it does impact students tremendously. But there's no getting around just how challenging it is. So I think what we had planned for this time was an opportunity for people to ask questions, to follow up on what's been said on today's meet materials, and in general give people a chance to kind of process the materials they've seen from me, the activities you've been doing there, and give you guys an opportunity to ask for feedback or further clarification of things that have happened today that you have questions about. I'll be perfectly honest, as a writer of the Common Core, nothing pleases me more than to show Oz for what it is. So let's pull down the curtains here and make sure people get their questions answered, so you guys feel good going out there. If not, you know, completely confident, at least feeling like you have a game plan moving forward.
Is there anybody with a question?
Kristen, asking your question.
Okay. I'm glad I can begin.
Yes, thank you.
I think one of the issues that came up kind of over and over today, and in all of our time working with text-dependent questions in general, goes back to just how far is too far with inferencing, and how we balance drawing conclusions versus just students' ideas and opinions. Do you get what I'm saying? And in question 6 from the Gettysburg Address was one of those questions that came up.
So for question number 6 on the Gettysburg Address handout, I think was one of the things that were raised?
Yeah, that's one of the things that was raised.
Yeah. I don't know if people have ready access to that question. It was a 2-part question. And it was it's an interesting one in the sense that I think the very first question, if asked kind of bare, wouldn't be text dependent. But if you think about the second question there as elaborating on and asking students to make inferences out of the first one, then I think it becomes a kind of a text-dependent question set. And I like the idea of sometimes having questions that have follow-up questions to them to show students how to dig deeper or to probe deeper together by putting those questions out there. The bigger question I think about inferencing is just to kind of give a definition of inferencing. You know, and I think it's worth just pointing out, especially for our EL population, I mean, inferencing happens at the sentence-to-sentence level when we're reading stories like Dick and Jane went up the hill, they fetched a pail of water. The they is an inference to Dick and Jane. I mean, that's an inferential motion that needs to be made by our students, and we need to help them recognize that. We sometimes take that for granted that that's just happening. But certainly, we hope that that's happening early on, taught early on. But bigger inferences happen from using, as someone put so eloquently in the text-dependent today's meet materials, the idea of trying to capture that rootedness in the text without being explicitly there, to find ways to talk about, as you guys were doing quite eloquently actually in your Churchill questions, how does Churchill organize his speech? That's a statement. There's no statement in the speech that says, I will now organize my speech into 3 areas. That will require students to make an inference out of that. Authors don't necessarily tell you, I'm going to go and divide my thing into 3 chunks. But they'll have to go and find those breaks in the chunks. And where's the transition in this passage? We look for those turn words like but and however and yet. And having students be able to understand and find those words, but then understand their function is itself an inference. Inferencing happens all the time. It's just an attempt to try to get around the idea that we're not always asking for students to do that write their work. Someone very early in the day in the transcript of today's meet made a reference to some work that Palm Springs had done with depth of knowledge questions. And I think the writers of the Common Core, at the end of the day, when we look at attempts to do depth of knowledge or Bloom's taxonomy or things like that, it does come down to two different big categories of activities. It's either students are asked to identify or students are asked to analyze. And when we're asking students to identify or analyze, those are the two big areas of activity that we have them do. Well, that's boils down to, in the Common Core language, of being able to go and cite directly, to name it, and or to make an inference about it. Those are the two big cognitive jumps that are in the standards. Go and find it, or go and make an inference out of what you found there. And a lot of the Common Core work is a reduction of that very sophisticated melting pot into those two big areas. And so the background knowledge that you folks have in the area of depth of knowledge, theory of knowledge, and or DOK, depth of knowledge / Bloom's taxonomy, can be layered quite easily over this material.
I think that I agree with you, but I think that the bigger issue, even with inferencing, it really becomes an issue when we ask questions like, why did the author? For example, the problem people were struggling with that particular question from Gettysburg is it stated, why does Lincoln shift? And in saying why he does that, I understand it's an inference, but I think people are really struggling with, but I'm guessing, I heard a lot of, and I've heard this with inference questions like that over and over, but they're just guessing why he did it. So it's kind of that drawing the line. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah, and I was trying to say earlier, I don't think it's a good text defense question if it was just the first question.
Right.
I think you can that the question becomes text dependent when you read the first question through the second one. If I were there, I would have done this talk with folks and saying, if students or teachers are only asking that first question, I don't think we can understand why Lincoln did that. Was it because he had, Raisin Bran in the morning instead of oatmeal? I mean, we don't know. We don't have access to his intentional states. We just don't have ability to go into his head. So for me, it really is that second question that makes a big difference. Now, how does Churchill organize his speech? Seems to me something that we can answer by inferencing out of text. But why Churchill chose to break it into 3 chunks here instead of 4? He could have, right? So I don't know that, again, why did the author do this kind of thing? Which goes back to, I think, a bigger point around the standards. I think a lot of our training as teachers has been around reading strategies. And so question the author is one of these kind of very popular reading strategies. Predict what's going to happen next, another very popular reading strategies. But all of these seem very non-text dependent strategies. And the problem, I think, if we were going to say broadly looking around the country, is that teachers have gotten very good at teaching their students these strategies as an end and not as a means to an end towards comprehension. And the worry is that we've left the text behind, so that kids are very good at speculating about why an author did something, but can't actually tell me what the teacher means. We have a technical term for that speculation here in New Hampshire. It's called I could say I have some students that are very good at that, and you have to reel them in from that. And that's something that's, again, a challenge as a teacher to do, but something I think turning away from and turning the focus back to the text is the meaning of that opening little exercise we did about what it means to read closely.
Do you have any other comments on some of the questions that you read on today's meet? You want to point out any that you specifically thought were strong questions or some that could be reworded?
I was thrilled to see so many people be very interested in the academic vocabulary work. I mean, I think that's a very good way in. It struck me then that many of the questions that came up, despite people's excitement around academic vocabulary, didn't necessarily focus on an academic vocabulary word. Maybe that's too simple, and the way in which the exercise was around it was only one of the 9 kind of areas. I would really encourage people to go back to the traditional text and think about identifying some of that key academic vocabulary and making sure that that gets asked. All of the 8 intervening standards, the rungs of the ladder, for the analogy that you saw before, will get asked in testing scenarios, but the research says that standard number 4 is particularly powerful. And you guys are a Park state. Park is going to emphasize academic vocabulary, and I think the number on average is about 1 out of every 4 questions is going to revolve around academic vocabulary, and then be able to figure out academic vocabulary in context. So it would be really great to see questions that did that kind of activity. You know, what is the meaning of X? What words and clues are present to help students determine the meaning of X in that sense?
David, I have a question about academic vocabulary. When we picked out, and they picked out academic vocabulary in the passage, I can't remember.
Voices of the Nation.
Yeah, Voice of the Nation. When you pick that out, should teachers teach that? When do they teach that before the text? Do they bring that up during the text? When do you teach that vocabulary?
So there's a bigger question about kind of lesson plan here, and how you go through, if you were reading that passage, how you might have students read it silently by themselves and do an activity where they might circle some words that they don't understand, and I'm, as a teacher, circulating, watching my students do their active reading and noting what words are getting circled, such that when I reach that word, when we're doing the close read of the text, I'm sure to frame a text-dependent question around it. Then we might have students read it out loud for fluency, because we know that hearing it on the ear really helps with comprehension, and I want a fluent reader to do that. And then start asking text-dependent questions, including ones that include issues of text dependency. I like to ask them in context. And so for me, I think that we should wait until we find those words in the actual text, because of course, the clues for teaching the students the skills for unpacking the meaning there are only present actually in the sentences around those actual words. But I wouldn't teach them all, of course. That would have reduced myself to this vocabulary. But it's funny, if you focus on a word, like in that passage, around the word extending, you get a whole bunch of the related words that are also academic vocabulary with it. It's a really powerful tool because they pick up by osmosis, not just the meaning of that word, but the meaning of several of the other academic vocabulary words that you would have identified. At that point in time. It's a very powerful way to teach comprehension through some of those words, and having students go and find and hunt down the meanings there. One question that I had back for the group, or maybe I should just say back for Sharon. Hi, Sharon. You wrote a question about the Part Text Complexity Analysis Worksheet, and I'm not quite sure I understand what you're referring to.
On the released items, they give for some.
On the release items.
They give some of the texts have been assessed or analyzed using this grid sheet, this rubric type thing, and they'll have very complex, I think was one, and what is it? Readily accessible. And the texts that they've published so far fall in that lower end. And so my teachers at my school are asking, which end do we go to when we're teaching the kids? We start at the readily accessible and then move them toward the very complex, toward the, the end of the year, and they're building to that.
Got it.
Because their question is choosing the text that they're going to use for close reading.
Yeah, there's another part of the story here. We've been focusing today on standards 1 and then standards 2 through 9 as a way of getting at 1. Everyone's been doing standard number 1 when you do text-dependent questions, because standard number 1 asks for evidence. Standard number 2 through 9 asks for different kinds of skills. Standard number 10 is really a standard that says, what kind of text are you using to do 1 through 9? And there's a longer story to be told about the text selection process that would require, I'm sorry to say, maybe some more PD somewhere down the line. The short story here is that there's a 3-step process for identifying complexity of text relative to the core that Park and teachers are using around the country based on the research in Appendix A. The first step is to use a computer tool, something like Lexile, and you can go to lexile.com and put your text in there right now and get a Lexile score. That gives a score that identifies where the text falls within a grade band. So for instance, there's grade bands for grades 4 and 5 and another grade band for grades 6 to 8. Now, if you have a text that falls within a particular grade band, then you need to do a qualitative analysis using some criteria to be able to determine whether it's, like you say, readily accessible or very complex, whether it's easier, has less complexity or more complexity. And that process helps you distinguish where it fits within the grade band. So whether it's a 6th grade text or a 7th grade text or an 8th grade text, or even, with finer nuancing, whether it's a text that you should be teaching, say, at the end of 6th grade or the beginning of 8th grade. And I think those determinations within the Park assessment model there that you're seeing is a picture of a kind of gradation of the time there. I think you'll see a slide up at some point in time here if you've not reached the end with my email address. Sharon, if you email me, I'd be happy to send you a rubric for making that determination that's, frankly, a lot more teacher-friendly than some of the Park materials are. I think the Park materials are pretty daunting to read from a teacher perspective. And I've tried to provide you today with materials that are easily processed by teachers. Just even having a rubric that fits on a page, I don't understand why Park doesn't understand that aspect of the job that we do.
Can you send that link to Janet?
Sure, be happy to.
David?
I will say, I'll make this invitation more broadly to the entire group. I think good PD doesn't end when we walk out the room at 3 o'clock today. And you should feel that you have some supports down the line. And certainly you have, obviously, Janet and her team right there. But I want you to make sure that you know that you can always reach out to me for a question that way. And so I want my email address out there for you, so that if you have a question as it pops up and would just like to hear from someone, I'd be happy to respond.
David, I had a question based on that text complexity worksheet by Park. I just happened to notice in the top right-hand corner that they had tweaked the Lexile levels versus the Lexile levels that are given to us with the grade bands in Appendix A, where they dropped from 30 and they also extended 30. Can you shed any light on that? Did they do that? Did they drop it because that would be more readily accessible? Then they extended it because that would be more, top of that band would be more very complex? What's going on with that Lexile level?
So that's done by Lexile.com, and they made that shift actually in August of 2012. And so you'll see in my materials that I'll send that it reflects that updated information. That's a little bit more inside baseball with Lexile, not necessarily responding to us, but based on their research. I applaud anytime someone broadens the range of a Lexile range in my classroom, knowing the diversity of students that I have in my classroom, and I'm sure the teachers in the room would nod their heads if I said, in the last 20 years, are the range of reading levels in your classrooms getting wider? And I think we all agree that it is. So that's a decision by them. It wasn't one that was the Common Core. The Common Core writers are using the research that's out there. And in fact, there's, I'll send along a handout. There's 6 different programs that people can use for making these determinations, and they all correlate. just fine. So I think that's important to be able to know that it's not a particular computer program, it's any one of the 6 can be used to do that first cut. Unfortunately, or fortunately, the computer programs can't do a whole lot of things that we want them to do. So a computer program would generate an answer that says the grapes of wrath actually Lexile's at 480, which is the Lexile range for 2nd or 3rd grade. Do you guys teach it in 2nd grade in Arkansas or 3rd grade? The grapes of wrath. Right? I mean, of course you don't teach it at those levels, and why not? Well, because the complexity of the grapes of wrath is way beyond that level because of the actual meaning that's going on. But we've all looked at Steinbeck before, and we know why it gets those low numbers from the computers, because of what the computers are measuring. Sentence length. Well, Steinbeck's sentences are really short, right? His vocabulary is super simple, but Of Mice and Men is a really complex book, and there's no way we're teaching it at the third grade level or even the 5th grade level. And that's why the research says that we've got to combine the computer scores with qualitative analysis. Now, the qualitative analysis requires us to look closely at some very specific criteria and use research that. Right now, the qualitative analysis that we've been doing in the country in the last 40 years is, gosh, this book just feels like an 8th grade text to me, right? I mean, we've said almost universally, oh, the Scarlet Letter, that's 10th grade. We just said that, and that's where it kind of lands. It just feels right. Unfortunately, over the last 40 years, the level of text complexity has actually gotten simpler and simpler in our classrooms, such that kids are going on to college and career paths, reading at a 2 to 4th grade levels below what they need to in order to be able to handle that manual to get that job at the Portsmouth Naval Shipyard, or to be able to enter, freshman year work at the University of Arkansas instead of taking remedial classes during that time. So that's the challenge of why the Lexile levels are aggressively paced over time, and why we want to be doing text-dependent questions and doing close reads to really test whether or not students are comprehending the text and teach them how to grapple with these complex texts. Texts that are, admittedly, going to be challenging for them. But we're going to offer them text supports in the form of text-dependent questions that are really, really the best thing out there in terms of scaffolding.
David, there was a question earlier in the day asking, so are there always correct answers to the text-dependent questions?
I saw that one. I think there are ways to frame text-dependent questions that have right and wrong answers. Those are certainly kind of right there questions. Inferences, though, oftentimes you can come up with better and worse inferences out of a text versus, quote, right and wrong ones. Also, there's good text-dependent questions that are open-ended. So if you go back to the very first thing that you guys read today, Alice in Wonderland, and look at one of the questions like the third one that you guys probably did, which was, describe the details of the rabbit found in paragraph 3. Well, that's pretty open-ended in terms of what details you could pull out. There's a bunch of right there details: wearing a waistcoat, has a watch in his pocket, he's in a hurry, and there's other ones there too that might say he's flustered, right? And that may be inferential. So there's an open-ended iteration here that could go on about details that way. But certainly text-dependent questions have an objective character to them, such that, we'll put it this way, no non-text-dependent question will ever show up on a PARCC test. Because, of course, in a non-text-dependent question answer, if it's subjective, then everyone's answer is correct. How would you feel if you saw a talking rabbit? Well, you might run away, or you might start up a conversation, right? Or you might give it a carrot, or you might go into its hole. I mean, there's all sorts of answers, and they're all correct, right? Versus, how did Alice react to the presence of a talking rabbit? Well, there's an answer that has a range of acceptable answers based on the text, but it's certainly not that, well, she decided to put her feet up on top of the table, right, and kick back. I mean, that's not an answer that's in the text.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
David, there's a question. It was I think it's the last question on the today's meet. It says, writing an essay after reading text, please define essay and might this involve other products like sequels, brochures? So when Park is gonna ask us to write an essay, or maybe even the answer, I mean, what are they looking for? Cause that's something we don't know right now.
There are good people who are trying to nudge them to release more information. It is not clear how extensive they'll do this. There is a lot of kind of things that we could talk about. So, for instance, let's start with, since you mentioned the word sequels, let's talk about narrative writing. The Park narrative writing assessment is going to require students to either continue a story that's already happened, or insert a particular episode in a story based on the evidence that's present. Since you're going to be attacking the story through a series of text-dependent questions, they'll read a story, they'll answer 5 to 7 questions about it, and then they'll be asked to write in response to it. What they're doing in those 5 to 7 questions is actually extracting evidence that they then can organize and create into then an understanding of the story that they could carry forward. So in my house, we read Minerich's Little Bear stories. There's a great story called Birthday Soup, where a series of animals comes in and brings Little Bear a present, and Little Bear invites them to stay for birthday soup. And there's an entirely conceivable Park assessment says, invent a new animal that comes to Little Bear's house and envision how Little Bear and this animal interact. Now there are some objective answers to that question, because Little Bear always says, thank you very much for the present that he gives, and would you like to have some birthday soup? And everyone who comes to Little Bear's house always says, happy birthday, Little Bear. Here's a present for you, and they hand over the present. So there's some objective answers about how students would structure and insert a story that if they were missing some of those elements would be less successful than answers that did continuation of that. There's a big picture that'll be played out here that, but again, we could come back and have some professional development on the writing standards in that way. Certainly, the other writing standards that are going to go on at the Park level is they're going to have a research simulation. So one of them's going to be a writing simulation. These are, at all grade levels, they're going to do these 3 things. They're going to do a narrative, they're going to do a writing simulation, where students are going to read 2 or more texts, then have to synthesize that and show that they are building an explanation or an argument, doing the kind of research writing that's required there. They don't have to go out and find the text that provided them, but they have to do that synthesis. And then the third writing task is to write a literary analysis, another argument or explanation of a literary piece, like Frost's The Road Less Traveled. Again, after having answered 5 to 7 text-dependent questions, they'll be asked to go and explain, was the narrator's, the voice of the poem, were they happy or sad, reluctant or eager to relate their tale, and did they feel like they made the right choice? Defend a position and use evidence from the text to support your claim. So those are the 3 different types of writing tasks that will show up on the Park assessment. And there's a bigger story to be told about each of them, but they won't be asked to build a brochure so much as right now offer up research, explanations, argumentative writing, and literary analysis, and then a continuation of a narrative. So effectively meeting standards 1, 2, and 3 of the writing standards. And that's going to happen at each grade level for grades 3 through 11. That happens at the performance-based assessment about 75% of the way through the year, so roughly in March. And then the end of year test for Park is in May, 90% of the way through the year, and that's strictly text-dependent questions. Both of those opportunities use text-dependent questions. Writing just happens earlier because, of course, it takes longer to grade writing and hand that back to teachers.
Any other questions that you guys have right now that you can think of? Anything you want to just add, just for us, food for thought before we talk to you here in a couple of weeks?
Yeah, I was pleased to see so many people, again, just the examples here, there was, lots of effort and emphasis on revising questions to either explicitly or implicitly require students to offer evidence. And I think that's challenging, but a good way. I will say that students quickly pick up on what you're asking them to do. So, in September and October, I'm asking my students, I'm framing my questions, using evidence from the text, do this other thing. But I pretty much, at the end of October here, I pretty much faded of prompting my questions there, because my students know that I'm looking for evidence, and their failure to give evidence, they would just get a blank stare from me, and they go, oh yeah, all right, I gotta go back to the text and make an inference from there, or use some text, write their information from the text. So I was really pleased to see, folks here in the middle of the day, Tammy and Melanie, working with Marcia and someone else about the revising issues there. And I think that's a really important part of this, is to think about how to fine tune it in kid language to get them to do what you want. The text-dependent question worksheet can be very helpful in that regard, to give you the steps to determine whether or not you actually have a good question in your hands. If you can pass those 3 steps, you really do have a solid question. And I thought many of these questions were really good, like the question Melanie asked this is Susan's question here, not that Melanie asked a bad one, but how does the author's choice of words in paragraphs 4 and 5 important to the tone of the story? That's a very specific question. Students will be very task-minded. They'll go into the task and go and looking at. And then, a part B follow-up. Which sentence from the story provides the best support for your answer to part A? To do that, you can see explicitly them building a question that'll show up on a Park-like exam, where the Park will ask you to go and say, what's the theme of the story, A, B, C, or D? And then the second question will be, what evidence is there from the story to go and support that? Choose one of the 4 following, or one of the 6 following, or 2 of the following 7 claims to back up that particular assertion. And it's going to be pretty tight, dependent on getting those points to be able to provide evidence to do that, and not just be able to randomly guess the theme through luck.
David, I wanted to, if you don't mind, if I can come back to the writing, and you were talking about there would be 3 forms of writing. There was a question about what that product would look like. Could you either restate what you said, or what would that product look like with those forms of writing?
And to frame that for you, we take the Arkansas benchmark test, where our kids, for the last, I don't know how many years, 10 years or more, we have kind of gotten into this 5-paragraph essay, and then open response for the reading. So I think that's what we're asking is it going to be, are some of the writing portions going to be whole essays where it's, 5 paragraphs or whatever, or what? I think, is that kind of what you're asking?
Well, I'm
Yeah.
going back to some of the possibilities with the new release in Park, is that it could take the form other than an essay. So I'm just.
I think where Elizabeth, in 2012, Park released the front and back page, and it gave bulleted, grade specific, elementary, then 6 through 8, and then 9 through 12. Products, writing products. That's where brochures, sequel, that's where all those products came from. That was 2012. But what was released in August, I'm not seeing any of those products. Like you said, everything was essay, essay, essay. So did something change, or they just haven't released something other than a quote essay? Because then, like Janet said, what's essay in your mind? Maybe it's our background knowledge cloud is.
No, I think that's a really fair thing. And I think it's really important to know that I don't speak for Park, although I am one of their reviewers. I work really closely with Susan Pimentel, one of the lead writers of the Common Core, and we've been reviewing new test items that they're going to be putting up in the next couple of weeks, actually. And what some of those items do is ask students to be able to kind of synthesize in essay form some of the materials that you heard there before. There's another testing group called SFAC, and they have their students do some of those more, I would call, esoteric products. I think Park is finding that it's going to be pretty hard to move away from the essay, simply because of all the other changes that are going on to make kind of teachers, how do you teach students to build a timed brochure, right, in 85 minutes? I think that's a reasonable demand on a teacher like myself. I'm a classroom teacher, and I'm not sure I could get my students to be able to read several materials, synthesize them, and build a brochure using computers. I don't know how that would feel. I think that's a great task to do in my classroom, and my students build brochures, recruiting people to their particular colonies when we're doing early American history, or brochures on the Scarlet Letter when we do things like that. But I don't see Park right now offering up items above and beyond what would be called, quote, traditional essays. The one place where that departs is in writing stories, i.e. meeting narrative number 3. And those stories, I think, are kind of interesting in the sense that they require evidence. They turn out to be pretty interesting, I think, creative writing exercises where you adopt the voice of the author and continue the story on or insert something there using evidence, what happens there. So stories that wouldn't be acceptable in Park views would be stories where the continuation of the story opened with a sentence, and then little Susie woke up and it was all a dream, and they tell a new kind of story. Or, Bill looked up and in the sky there was a shining glowing disc, and little Meox was sucked up into the air and zooped away to the planet Zargon. I mean, those aren't present, evidence in the text. So the stories that are discontinuous with the narrative that had gone on before would be seen as uncreative, or at least not responsive to the prompt. I wouldn't say that's not creative writing. It's just not creative writing the way in which the text prompts for Park will go. But otherwise, the two other exercises right now are in time frames of 85 minutes for the research and 80 minutes for the literary analysis. So it's an 80 minutes time where they're given time to, say, read Robert Frost's, Two Wits to Virginia Woods poem, and then answer 5 to 7 text-dependent questions about it, and write an essay. I think that's going to be plenty challenging without asking them to go and develop a brochure on why you should go to, take fork left in the road versus fork Y. And so I'm not seeing any items yet that do that. I have seen, interesting enough, things where students are asked to synthesize material seen on video for the very first time, and some of the unreleased items that will be coming out shortly. There are embedded videos, something that had been present for a long time in the other testing consortia. And here for the first time are videos that students are going to have to use as part of the evidence to synthesize in their analysis, in their essays, let's say. Park doesn't have an answer for whether or not there's 3 paragraphs or 2 paragraphs. They do have particular answers about what a claim looks like, an argumentative claim versus a explanatory claim, and what those two types of writings would be like in a setting that asks you to do explanation versus doing argumentation, i.e. respond to standard 1 versus respond to standard 2.
We have some exemplars in the back of our Common Core book that has our standards in it. Can you tell us some other places that we can look at for some exemplars of what writing will look like at the different grade levels?
Yes, I can actually. There's so if what you're referring to is Appendix C.
Yes.
The one kind of caveat to think about with Appendix C, and it's there in writing, is that those examples, of course, were examples that were created independently of the standards actually existing at that time. And we searched around for student examples that attempted to do that sort of work to show what that was. If you go to achievethecore.org, this is the group that we set up for, the writers of the Common Core set up after the fact to give away materials for free. In fact, you go to that site and you can see in big bold letters, steal these tools. They'll be there to go and look at. And in there, we have a new section called Student Writing Samples. And I can just send a copy of the link directly out to folks there too. But we've gone and collected many more examples of student writing to be able to go look at. In fact, the document itself is over 300 pages long of student examples of writing that we think are good examples of writing. The park hasn't released student examples yet. And you know, that's in part because not a whole lot of people have taken those sample tests yet. And as soon as they have some sample models, I think you'll see more. But the materials on Achieve the Core, I think, are good examples of where to go to.
I have one pulled up from Achieve the Core, and it's called by the Vermont Writing Collaborative with Student Achievement Partners, in Common Effective Writing for All Students, collection of all student work samples K-12. Is that the one you're talking about, or is it a different one?
That's the one I'm talking about.
Okay.
But those are, you know, that if you go and download the big PDF file, I mean, I think it runs over 300 pages.
Actually, I think it's 600 pages.
889.
Yeah.
889, okay.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, we've heard this from many educators before and really thought that would be a useful tool to put out there. And well, you know, no one's beholden to these examples. Certainly, people really do listen to Susan Pimentel and David Coleman when they say these are good examples. And so I think that this is a good resource for people to have.
Well, David, it is right about 4 o'clock your time, and I have a feeling that you probably need to head on. We appreciate you so much joining us today. And any parting words for us?
What you did today is the first bite out of an apple. We pick apples up here in New Hampshire, and there's a lot more of your apple left to eat. And I really encourage you to take this work that you did in practice today and try it in your classrooms. To go back there and ask a text-dependent question or two on Monday. To think about how I might redesign a lesson in 3 weeks from now where I have a series of text-dependent questions going. This will be very hard to do every day very well, just because we're so in the middle of it. But I think if we start applying some of this material, I think we'll be, pleasantly surprised by how responsive students are to doing this work. And, the proof's in the pudding, how much reading comprehension does improve over time when there's a truly a focus on the text and relieving you of some of the burden of trying to figure out ways to retell the text in your own words to help students themselves make that meaning. And I think that's an exciting process to be a part of. You guys are in a good place to be starting this work, and I just encourage you to use some of the materials and the templates that you saw today to help you in building that. And if you run into a jam, don't be afraid to reach out to me and say, what do you think of this question? Or do you have a tool that allows me to do this? I'm trying to go and accomplish this in my classroom. How does that feel? Let's keep the conversation going.
And next Friday, these same ladies and gentlemen are coming back to write text-dependent questions for on some text. So we're going to get some practice right away. So thank you very much, and we appreciate you. Guys, here you talk about the evaluation. Thanks, David. See you.
Take care.
We have sent out in an email to everybody a reflection survey. It's in your email. You just pull it up. You just fill it in. There's 4 statements, and then there's an additional comment box at the bottom. And we would appreciate your feedback on what we've done today. If you are with elementary, if you could just wait for just a minute, I'll go ahead and hand out the papers with the people in which groups they're in. If I left somebody off of the list, elementary, just let me know and I'll just put you with the group. I tried to do my best to make sure you were kind of put in a group that you were either working with as a UBD writer or that you were familiar with because you coached that particular level of teaching. So if you need to make sure that you're on the list, please check the document and make sure you're on the list.
And I'll just send out an email to the middle school, junior high, and high school people, but I did the same. I tried to make sure that I kind of looked around and who the ones that you've kind of worked with, that's who I put you with. And we're not doing social studies this time, so apologize to social studies. We're going to stick with language arts. But Carrie, are they bringing 1 or 2 texts next time?
It would be best if you brought one piece of text that you think would be good for that particular unit. We have, I know elementary, we have 5 people in each group. And so we'll have lots of good heads around the table to come up with those text-dependent questions. I also have some other exemplar texts that were given to me by the UBD writers, the ones that they thought would be a piece of text that we might want to look at. So we actually will have 2 different pieces of text at the table when we meet.
And I may ask y'all to bring a couple of pieces of text, and then if we have time, we'll see. But I will send that email out here in just a few minutes. So as you finish your evaluation, or whatever that thing's called, the reflection for the day, you are free to go. Just, if you don't mind kind of cleaning up your area, if you can roll up your power cords so that they're just, in fact, if you could put your power cords up in those boxes, that would be great. Thank you guys. Friday.
Because what I did was I was looking at this show.